Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 46. Sakura dreamed of red skies over Konoha. The color red was sometimes just enough to make her heart freeze in her chest and put tremors through her very bones. Even putting on her clothes each morning could be enough to remind her of the visions Itaki had shown her. Even getting a passing glance at the soft red sheen of Gaara's hair could send her over the edge. But now, seeing red, Sakura did not feel fear. There was a strange effect on her dream now, and not just the redness that permeated over everything like a thin film. In most dreams, Sakura moved as she would awake. Even if she wasn't completely lucid, she still acted as herself. In this dream, however, she was not herself. She was another. She did not feel fear at these red skies, because she was another. Instead, she felt only resentment? Yes, that was the emotion she felt now, faint, almost buried beneath the myriad of other strange sensations. Resentment towards the village she had grown up in and cherished. Resentment for what they had done to her, allowed to happen. Resentment for those who lived in the illusion of peace while others laid in forgotten graves while wars were waged behind the scenes. I will put this fragile world to rest. There will never be war again. And then Sakura's eyes turned, moving impossibly fast and yet desperately slow towards the building next to her. When she caught sight of the window, she saw. Who are you? Who are you? Sakura awoke so smoothly that she was convinced she was still dreaming, her hand shooting forward to grasp at Gaara's wrist before he could touch her shoulder. The sand swirled, and her hand pummeled against the hard grains before it could reach her companion. For a moment, Sakura was simply confused. Never before had she moved fast enough to trigger Gaara's sand, nor had she ever tried to. The sand protected him from anything it deemed hostile. Was she acting hostile? Sakura, Gaara's voice held a tinge of worry. You were having bad dreams. No, Sakura answered immediately. Her voice felt strange in her throat. I'm not sure what it was. Her amulet felt hot around her neck. Out of instinct, Sakura pushed herself out of bed so she could look across the room at her mirror. She saw herself, bed hair and all, wrapped in the comfortable pajamas she hadn't been able to wear since she'd left Konoha months ago. She saw herself. Sakura. I'm okay. Just a weird dream. Not a bad one. She saw Sai resting on the mattress nearby, looking towards her with a gaze that was a bit too intense even for her to decipher. Confusion, or perhaps intrigue. Maybe even distrust. Sai had always been difficult, and somehow the fact that he was learning how to express emotion made it even harder. Sometimes Sai would want to express happiness and come across as cold, and vice versa. Gaara, however? Definitely concerned. The boy could put on the facade of a stone face, but around Sakura he was always far more open. Sakura reached out again, this time slower and more gentle, so she could put her hand on his own. I'm okay. She repeated. She didn't believe herself, but for the boys, it was enough. Breakfast was usually a quiet affair in the Harano household. Sakura's father needed at least an hour of movement before he could even be considered awake, and her mother liked her mornings calm. It worked well even with Gaara and Sai around, who were both somewhat quiet people by nature anyway, and it gave Sakura an opportunity to think without being drawn into conversation. At least, that was what she would have thought, until the front door was almost knocked down by the full force of Jinhuriki enthusiasm. I'm looking for Sakura Harano. Does she live here? Sakura scrambled to get to the door, knowing full well that Fia would wake up the whole neighborhood if she was allowed to knock for much longer. She sprinted to the door, pulling it open and narrowly dodging Fia's next attempt at a knock. Oh. Fia grinned. I thought I smelled you in here. Shivuki told me if I didn't go get energy out of my system, he'd kick me over the wall, so I thought I'd go tell you about what I found. She sniffed the air. Is that food? Come on in, Fia. Sakura couldn't help but smile a little at the sight of her friend. She knew how excited Fia had been to see new sights and people. Being cooped up in a Konoha was likely torture. If a loud morning was the price to pay to give her some time out, Sakura was willing to pay it. Plus, in the Harano household at least, there was always extra breakfast. So I was walking around this morning looking for a place to watch the sunrise, cause you rarely get to see the sunrise when you're in Taki, you know? Underground and all. And I was watching all the Konoha shinobi get up to go start their missions and whatnot. Fu talked as she made her way to the table, not even stopping for breath as she sat down next to Gaara. And then I saw her, Sakura. Saw who? The girl I'm gonna marry. Sakura let herself laugh a little at this, mostly because Fu's optimism was just so refreshing after the doom and gloom around planning the demise of Root. You found your future wife, huh? Do you even know her name yet? And no. Yes. Maybe. Fu crossed her arms. I'm not stupid, I know I gotta know her name first before I marry her. But she's a shinobi, so I didn't want to distract her from her duties by asking her out in front of her commander. She's your age though, Sakura, so I figured you'd be able to tell me who she was and maybe even introduce me. My age. Sakura only knew a couple of kunoichi her age in the village, so either Fu was off or she meant either. Describe her for me? How could I ever even begin to describe her? Fu seemed to have stars in her eyes as she began to talk. She has long, beautiful hair like midnight, and her eyes shine like diamonds, but it's also a little weird. I've never seen anyone with eyes like that before, so I wonder if it's like a clan thing, so she might even have some cool power. Wouldn't it be awesome if she had a cool jutsu that only she could do? Sakura felt her heart sink. She knew exactly who Fu was talking about now, and she was doomed. That's Hinata Hyuga you're talking about. Hinata, Fu said the name with reverence, completing missing Mabuki putting a plate of food in front of her. That's such a beautiful name, Sakura, you have to introduce me now, you have to. I don't know if she's such a good idea, Fu. Sakura countered, trying her best to be gentle. The Hyuga are a really powerful clan here in Konoha, and she's the heir to the main branch. I don't know if her family would let her marry a foreigner, and you're sworn to Taki. That's okay. I can be both. Fu insisted. I can go half and half. We're supposed to be aligned anyway, right, so I can do both. Plus, she's already got a crush on Naruto, and she's had it bad since we were kids. Naruto? Fu thought, then realized who Sakura meant. The Kyuubi boy? Him? Naruto, she stood up, sending her chair clattering to the floor as she held a fist to the air. Naruto? Then that means that he's my rival in love. Well, she was handling the bad news well, at least. Sure, Fu. He's your rival. Sakura giggled as she ate. Though I don't think Naruto's put together that Hinata likes him that way, so please don't go charging in for a fight without explaining it. Oh, we're not going to fight. Not yet. Fu insisted. She noticed Sakura eating and pulled her chair back up so she could start to inhale her own food, pausing occasionally to get her words out. Oh no. Not yet. Because he's taking the Churyunin exams too, right? That means, I'm gonna kick his butt in the exams. I'm gonna kick his butt and I'm gonna look great doing it, and Hinata will fall in love with me. Sakura was fairly certain it wasn't that easy, but she wasn't going to dissuade her. Even for Hinata's sake, just having someone around who thought so highly of her from a single glance, it might do wonders for the girl's self-esteem. Plus, Naruto would probably be more than happy to have a Jinhuriki rival that could keep up with him in a match. And as for Fu, well, it was a long shot that this crush would ever come to fruition, but who was she to say what the future held? Hinata was the Hyuga heir, but it was a well-known secret that her father vastly preferred her younger sister Hinabi. Maybe the Hyuga elder would be less strict with Hinata's future prospects if he had already given up. It was a sad situation that Hinata was in either way. Sakura felt for the girl. Naruto had made the declaration that he would change the Hyuga clan, once he was Hokage. She only hoped that was something he could accomplish. Phew, in the meanwhile, well, now she had a goal, Sakura supposed, which would be good for her. Plus, even if it didn't work out with Hinata, getting friendly with the Hyuga clan would be beneficial for Taki in the long run, and strengthening the new Konoha/Taki alliance. Sakura let herself bask in Fu's declarations as she ate. Maybe her optimism for the future would be contagious. Gaara was more nervous here in Konoha than he'd ever been before in his life. It was perhaps exacerbated by the fact that Sakura was still having nightmares. She claimed she was fine, but Gaara knew she hadn't slept so strangely before she'd had her run-in with Itachi. And on top of that, as of the night before, now Shikaka was beginning to get worried, and the beast was vague as to the reasons why. All Gaara got were feelings of unease in a single, ominous phrase. The energy that girl has with her, it reminds me of something. Shikaka had been alive for centuries. Gaara still wasn't sure if the reason for his vagueness was due to forgetfulness, or simply not wanting to say. Gaara promised himself he would interrogate Shikaka further that night, but for now there were more pressing matters to worry for. This was the evening that Sakura would attempt to infiltrate the Uchiha compound with the Nara, and that alone was a second worry. The last time Gaara had let Sakura wander off on her own, she'd had a run-in with two Akatsuki. Maybe it was irrational, but Gaara couldn't help but wonder what Sakura would run into this time. The girl attracts trouble like a magnet. And yet, Gaara couldn't bring himself to voice his concerns further. These plans were necessary, these actions necessary, and on top of that, Sakura looked so happy to see her childhood friends that he couldn't bring himself to distract her from that. As they meandered their way through the Konoha streets, Gaara kept an eye on the surrounding people. Most were civilians, but peppered throughout were what Gaara had deduced to be several Umbu agents, no doubt ordered to keep an eye on the three of them. They were foreigners now, something Gaara was long used to experiencing at this point, but Sakura and Sai had never been strangers in their own home. He wondered at first if Sakura had even thought that she might be being watched, but he occasionally saw her hands flicker in the sequence he'd come to recognize as her sensing jutsu. She was keeping an eye out, so perhaps she'd caught on yet. They were going on an important errand before their scheduled rendezvous with Ino in the evening, and Sakura hadn't yet mentioned what the errand entailed. However, it eventually became clear as they reached the edge of a vast grassy field, a Konoha training ground. In the distance, Gaara saw three shinobi running laps, egged on by an enthusiastic sensei. The Churyunin exams are in 2 weeks. You're going to need to run faster than that if you want to be prepared. If any of the team protested, they were drowned out by the loud response of the bowl-cut boy in front, who yelled his agreement before starting to sprint even faster around the ground's perimeter. Sakura was quiet at first, watching with a smile on her face. I remember them. Sai commented quietly, so that only Gaara could hear. Those two are annoying. Gaara's memory drew him back to a year ago. He remembered it, one of the first times he'd ever felt fear. A blur of green smashing through his sand with raw speed and force. The feeling of a fist breaking against his sand armor. Knowing, if he didn't move fast enough, that something would break. Gaara felt a shudder work through him, and Sai took it for agreement. Sakura, however, considered him a dear friend. After watching him long enough, she cupped her mouth with her hands and yelled loud enough to reach the ears of the running shinobi. Hey Lee! Gaara saw the boy startle, looking about for the source of his name. Then, even from the great distance, Gaara saw a wide grin grow on his face. Sakura! Lee waved and jumped in the air, clearly excited, and then he began to run towards them. Only this run was even faster than his earlier jogging had been, so fast that Gaara's memory overtook him again, and he felt the fear of facing down a foe that was moving way too fast. In retrospect, Lee had probably just been trying to go for a rather enthusiastic hug. But Gaara, already on edge and perhaps a bit too protective of Sakura, couldn't stop his sand from doing what it had tried to do back then, and succeeded in doing now. And naturally, moving as fast as he was, Lee couldn't help but run into his shield of sand at full force. There was a bit of a crunch as body hit wall, and Gaara heard a startled squeak come from Sakura. For a moment, Gaara feared the worst. I heard him, again. But the boy popped up, looking not too worse for the wear, only sporting a small bruise where he'd met the wall head first. Ah, Gaara, your sand is as tricky as ever. I'm sorry. It is only a sign that I have been too lax in my training. Since I was not quick enough to surpass your sand this time, I will have to run another 100 laps. How about later? Sakura suggested, offering a hand to help Lee stand. Besides, Lee, didn't you make me promise we'd do something when I finally got back to Konoha? Lee grinned. Yes, that is right. A race in order to determine who has been training the hardest. It didn't take too many words to convince the others to take a break, and the team leader, Guy, was that the name, was more than happy to referee. The other two teammates came and sat down on the grass next to Gaara to take a breather. Gaara remembered them both vaguely. The girl, Tenten, had faced off with his sister in the last exams. The boy, Niji, had faced Naruto. A year had done much for them, both were taller now, and the training they were enduring had started to put them into far better shape than most shinobi Gaara had seen. They'd be formidable foes to anyone at this point, even still as genin. I didn't realize that Sakura had enough energy to keep up with Lee. Tenten commented as she watched the race begin. Has she really been training like he does? Less lately. Gaara admitted. With travel, she can't run laps. But in IWA, yes. Well, it's a good thing I don't have to face her in the exams, then. I worry enough about having to go up against Lee or Niji. Tenten groaned. Or, well, someone like you. That brings up an interesting point. Sai commented. He'd already pulled out his notebook and had begun to sketch. Assuming we don't fail horribly in our attempts to unite the shinobi countries, we are going to need ways to determine rank amongst our number. Right now with the three of us, things are easy. If our numbers grow, it won't be. Are you saying you think we should have exams? Maybe. Sai answered with a small shrug. Beyond that, the villages will want to have a way to determine the strength of our shinobi, otherwise they might question our ability to maintain peace. I wouldn't be surprised if... And then Sai paused, his pencil hesitating on the page. Oh. He said simply. I see. You see. What Shikamaru meant. Gaara wasn't sure at all what Sai was talking about, but they couldn't discuss it here in front of near strangers. Though Gaara had to wonder why Sakura hadn't asked to include Lee and his team in the plotting against Root. Were they untrustworthy? No, not to Sakura anyway. Perhaps there was another reason he hadn't yet considered. It was about 10 more minutes before the silhouettes of Lee and Sakura became visible in the distance. If Gaara had heard correctly, they'd raced around the perimeter of the village. Now they were neck and neck, running at top speed towards where Guy was waiting for them in the middle of the field. It wasn't Lee's full speed, Gaara knew that much. The boy still had his weights on, and perhaps that was how he managed to make it fair for Sakura, who had gotten faster, but nothing like Lee. Still, that didn't seem to stop Lee from putting in maximum effort, and Gaara could tell that Sakura was struggling to keep speed. Still, he couldn't help but be a little bit proud when the race was too close for even Guy to call. Just what I expected of my eternal rival. Lee proclaimed, wheezing from the effort. I have not had such a good run in several months, Sakura. Wait, eternal rival? Sakura questioned. I thought that, isn't Niji? Niji is my rival too, yes, but only you have succeeded in pushing me beyond my limits. Because of you, Sakura, I am encouraged to be even greater than before. Sakura was quiet for a moment, and Gaara could see a flurry of emotions pass through her before she landed on somewhere between surprise and happiness. Gaara might have even sworn he saw happy tears in her eyes, though it might have just been a trick of the light. She held out her fist towards Lee for a fist bump. All right then, eternal rival. The two laughed, laying down on the grass to catch their breath. Gaara saw Sai sketching out of the corner of his eyes, now with the exhausted racers as his subjects. They really are strange. Sai commented. But he said it with such an inflection that Gaara couldn't help but wonder if he had started to enjoy the strangeness that Sakura attracted around her. Either way, it was enough for him just to see her happy. Sai had grown up in Konoha, watched its borders for as long as he could remember, and yet he hadn't known its inhabitants were so curious. Ino and Sakura seemed like they were speaking a language all their own as they talked. There were recognizable words, sure, but they spoke so fast, sometimes answering incomplete sentences, and Sai found himself struggling to keep track of all of the information being discussed. Training, people, the neutrality project, what other countries looked like, and then, what Ino thought was apparently the most important subject. So are there any cute boys in IWA? Or in Taki? Ino got a look on her face that Sai recognized as slyness, and Sakura turned as red as a cherry with the question. I haven't exactly been thinking about that, thank you very much. There's been other things on my mind. Sai noticed, and it happened so quickly that Ino and Sakura didn't notice it at all, that Gaara fidgeted a small bit upon the mention of cute boys. Was it possible he had seen a cute boy in IWA? No, he didn't remember Gaara fixating on anyone other than Sakura. Perhaps this was the emotion called jealousy? Maybe Gaara's attachment had grown beyond that of friendship. Oh, I see what's going on. Ino continued to pry, still just as sly as before. After all, you've got a cutie right here, so who needs anyone else? It took Sai a moment to register that Ino was looking at him now. Oh, it was him that she was calling cute. That was strange. Was she making fun of him? No. The girl appeared serious. Sakura had warned Sai not to do anything to piss Ino off. Ino was a dear friend. If Sai upset her, Sakura would take it out on him. So, he had to be careful with his response. He had to say the opposite of how he felt, that was what he had begun to figure out. Whatever his first thought was, don't say that. So. You're cute as well. What? Ino had turned red at the compliment, and Sakura had yelled out in protest, looking very upset. You call me fucking ugly and Ino pig gets cute? What the actual hell, Sai? Oh, come on, billboard brow, don't be upset because Sai knows true beauty when he sees it. Ino recovered quickly, blowing Sai a kiss as she talked. He's clearly got good eyes on him. It's nice to have a boy recognize my beauty for once. Sakura fumed in her corner of the table, and Sai realized he might have blundered again. He'd have to confess to Sakura later. As far as he was concerned, Ino was rather plain. They had met at this particular restaurant in the early evening. Sakura and Ino actually had wanted to catch up, beyond the plan Shikamaru had for them. Once the sun started to set, the four of them would retreat to Ino's home to catch up further. In actuality, Sakura would be left behind here under a hench disguise, while Gaara used a clone to pretend Sakura was with them. That meant, for a few hours at least, Sai and Gaara would need to keep Ino entertained. Perhaps for now it was better that he'd gotten on Ino's good side. Alright, then, what about you, Ino? Sakura demanded. I mean, well, her demanding posture deflated with her words, and now Sakura simply looked nervous. I mean, look, Sasuke isn't around anymore, so it's probably time to move on, right? Yeah, maybe so. Ino agreed, just as morose at the mention of the Uchiha traitor. Sakura, Sai had learned early on, had been very attached to Sasuke. Ino too seemed to have this attachment. What was it about the Uchiha, Sai wondered, that so many were eager to come to his defense? Sai found himself strangely desiring to meet the boy. Well, okay, I'll tell you if you guys promise to keep it a secret. The moroseness left the table, and Sakura was suddenly all in once again, leaning against the table as she looked to Ino eagerly. Oh Ino, you know I can keep a secret. And now you gotta tell me. I don't know, you're going to laugh. I won't laugh, Ino, promise. Pinky promise. Pinky promise. Sakura held out her pinky finger, and Ino did similar. They shook, and Sai wondered what sort of symbolism the pinky had behind it. He'd heard of bandit lords cutting off the pinkies of disobedient subordinates, maybe it was related? He took more notes in his book, making his own promise to research such gestures later. Alright, so, you know how Naruto's been on our team recently. Sakura's eyes widened, and she put a hand over her mouth. No way, you're saying dash. It's not like, I mean, I don't know. Ino replied, turning red once again as she buried her face in her hands. Listen, he was kind of annoying at first, and I didn't really like having him on the team then. He's loud and he just kind of runs into things without thinking and, well, but then he started listening to Shika and I more, and he started kind of helping out more than he used to, and suddenly I realized that if he wasn't around we wouldn't be doing missions nearly as well. And he's like a puppy. We kept inviting him out to eat with the team and he was always just so happy to spend time with us, and even on missions he just looked so eager to help and be part of the team and I think sometimes, even if I think a mission is going to go bad, I think sometimes he smiles and I know everything's going to be okay, you know. Yeah. Sakura's smile had turned fond as she listened. I know exactly what you mean. So, maybe he's a little cooler than I thought, that's all. You know, if you told him that, I think you'd make his life. All he's ever wanted is to be accepted by people. Oh my gosh, I can't just say that sort of thing to him. Ino seemed to turn even redder, and Sai wondered how much blood a human face could handle rushing through it all at once. More than he'd originally thought, it seemed. I mean, I don't even know if I could. Come on, Ino, you told Sasuke he was awesome all the time. Why yeah, I guess I did. Ino let out a deep breath, folding herself over the table. Maybe if the time is right. Sai had heard that romantic feelings were particularly difficult to manage. En route, they were encouraged not to have them, even more so than the other feelings that were discouraged. Romantic attachment led to a conflict of interests. How could one dedicate themselves to the village if they had someone else they were more attached to than the other villagers? But for Ino and Sakura, discussing romantic attachment seemed as easy as breathing, like they'd been doing it all their lives. And Sakura, despite her attachment to Sasuke Uchiha, had not been hindered by her emotions. Gaara, despite his attachment to Sakura, had not gotten weak. In fact, Gaara in particular seemed almost stronger for it, more capable of protecting her than someone who was more neutral. Maybe, there was more to these emotions than even Danzo had realized. As the sun began to set, Sakura excused herself to the restroom. She didn't really need to go, it was simply a way to get into a room where she wouldn't be watched. Sakura Haruno went into the ladies' room. A perfectly disguised sand clone of Sakura Haruno walked out. Sakura waited, knowing that the clone would be leaving with Ino and the boys soon. Shikamaru would be waiting for her outside once the coast was clear. She gave herself 10 minutes before executing a henge technique. She didn't need to look fancy. Just different. Glasses, dark hair, and different colors for her outfit. The woman who walked out of the restaurant looked nothing like Sakura Haruno, and the only reason that Shikamaru knew it was her was because of a passphrase determined the night before. You're the man to ask about ground antler powder. Yeah, I guess that's me. Shikamaru rubbed the back of his neck. Pretty good look you've got there. Do you think there's anyone nearby to worry about? Sakura let out a quick sensing pulse. There were shinobi around, of course, but none close enough to be watching her, nothing like how the Umbu had been trailing her before. We're clear, she said with a smile. Worked like a charm. Don't say that until we're back home and not in a jail cell. Shikamaru countered. We still have a lot to do tonight. The Uchiha clan compound was fairly open, and Shikamaru had feared if they had tried to infiltrate in the daytime that someone might catch sight of them from outside the compound borders. At night, it was easier to move about unseen, and Inara at night was even more at ease than most other shinobi were. Shadows were Shikamaru's domain. Sakura just had to follow his lead. As they approached the compound, Shikamaru led them to a thickly wooded area just outside the border. There was no way they could get past the Uchiha seals, Shikamaru had determined, but the seals' border was a simple dome over the complex. It didn't go beneath the ground, because the Uchiha hadn't thought anyone would be stupid enough to try and burrow in, especially when the clan had still been alive. A tunneling jutsu, especially like the one Sakura had become especially proficient in, was the perfect way to enter the compound without triggering its defenses. It was so simple that Sakura hadn't thought it would work. But one hand sign and a quick bit of tunneling later, she and Shikamaru popped up inside the compound. It was silent there, as silent as a graveyard, which was fitting. There was a hollowness there that put Sakura in a state of unease. Had Sasuke really lived here all these years alone? It was no wonder he was so haunted by his past, so driven by vengeance, having had to live here with the very blatant reminder of the clan's absence. The buildings were perfectly preserved, enough so that Sakura found herself expecting people to suddenly walk in and out of them, as though they'd been here the whole time. We need to find where Sasuke lived. Shikamaru told her, keeping ducked behind building walls as he moved deeper into the compound. His father was the clan head, and Itaka would have lived there as well. What exactly are you trying to find out here? Proof of conspiracy. You really think you'll find that here? Not in Sasuke's house, not really, but I'd like to try searching there first before I resort to doing something really awful. Shikamaru, what the heck are you planning? Just hope we find something in the house, then I won't have to tell you. Sakura bit her lip, nervous. She trusted Shikamaru, right? The answers would come with time. It was easy enough to find the building Shikamaru was looking for. It was easily the biggest one in the compound, and the one that was the most maintained out of all of them. While the other buildings were covered in dust and leaves and the various wears of time, this building was relatively clean. Sasuke had lived here up until a year ago, so of course he would have maintained it. Sakura hoped she'd feel a bit safer inside the building, knowing that they were unlikely to be spotted once inside, but knowing she was walking around Sasuke's home was enough to make her stomach sink. There was a kitchen, and she caught a brief whiff of decayed food, left behind. There were pictures on the wall of Sasuke's family, and she saw him as she remembered him as a young boy, along with what was clearly Itachi and his parents. With every creak of the floorboards, Sakura felt that an Uchiha ghost might come for them any minute. They weaved in and out of rooms, Sakura following Shikamaru closely as he looked for whatever it was he was looking for. Eventually, they made their way outside again to the space behind the building, and it was there Sakura saw the massive shrine. Ah! That's probably it. Shikamaru headed towards it without delay. Once they were inside the shrine, he began to speak again. I remember hearing my dad talk a lot about the Uchiha clan. After the Kyuubi attack, there were a lot of people who believed that an Uchiha was involved in making it go on a rampage. After all, the last time it rampaged, it was being controlled by Madara Uchiha. Right, Sakura thought back to her conversations with Kakashi and Oniki. Their theories, her own theories, theories she'd had yet to explore further. So why are we here in this shrine? My dad notices a lot of things, you know. He's a pretty smart guy. He always talked about how the Uchiha looked more and more anxious in the year before the massacre, like they knew something was going to happen. And at that time, people were treating them worse and worse, like pariahs. That sort of thing happening to such a strong clan, makes you wonder how the clan took it. How the clan took it, you don't think, it clicked for Sakura all at once. You don't think they were planning on splitting from Konoha, do you? I can only theorize without proof. I think they were planning on either leaving or rebelling. And why wouldn't they? The village hated them, so why would they stay aligned with people who didn't appreciate what they did for the village? Shikamaru began to tap at the walls of the shrine, looking around and listening as he explored the small room. Naturally, they would have had to plan things in secret. The compound is protected, but you and I just proved it's easy enough to break in. They needed somewhere nobody else knew about to meet. Maybe even somewhere that other clan members didn't know about. Only the ones they thought were strong and loyal enough to the clan. So you're just looking for signs of a meeting place? Even if we find one, that's not going to be enough to prove anything. Well, that's technically not all I'm looking for, Shikamaru admitted. I guess since you aren't a clan kid you wouldn't know, but I figure most clans operate kind of the same. I obviously won't tell you where, but the Naras have their own secret meeting room to discuss clan business. It's also where all of our clan scrolls and records of our jutsu are kept. Oh. Sakura realized. You're not looking for the meeting place, you're looking for the clan secrets. Bingo. Plus, if they were planning a coup, they might have left behind notes. And, if we find proof they were planning a coup, then that proves a theory of mine correct. Which is that Itachi wasn't completely a crazy bastard and Danzo might have orchestrated something really nasty. Oh fuck. From what she knew of Danzo and Root, they worked for the protection of the village. Whatever it took to keep it safe. The Uchiha planned a coup. The safety of the village was threatened. Itachi, who clearly had history with Danzo, was convinced. Convinced that it would be better if the Uchiha clan died before threatening the village. Fuck, are you serious, Shikamaru? Sakura let herself curse aloud, not particularly caring how loud she got. You think Danzo orchestrated the massacre? And Itachi agreed. On the condition that little baby brother gets spared and protected. That is so fucked up. We don't have any proof yet. And even if we find plans, that's still not enough proof. But it'll be a start. And, bingo. Shikamaru knelt, pulling aside a tatami mat and revealing a wooden door in the floor beneath. Hidden meeting place is found. How clever of you. Now, I will need you to step away from the mat. Sakura froze as a voice sounded from behind them. That voice. That voice. She turned, her kunao already drawn as she faced the speaker. She hadn't even felt them approach, hadn't even heard them. But now, squinting through the darkness, Sakura realized exactly where she'd heard that voice before. She'd dreamed it. She'd seen that mask in the window's reflection in her dream, a swirl of black and orange that centered on a single hole around their right eye. Sakura felt fear. You. She said simply. We have much to discuss, don't we, Sakura Harano? The person spoke, and Sakura could almost feel the power this man wielded from his words alone. She couldn't stop herself from trembling, couldn't stop herself from wanting to drop this stupid quest and just run. But running was the one thing she couldn't do now. This person wanted to talk. All right. Sakura agreed. Then start talking. Chapter 47. It had started to rain. Gaara had sat in on enough of Sakura's lessons with Oniki to know that rainwater heavily altered the earth it landed on, and if one had not trained in the manipulation of water chakra, moving earth in the rain was exponentially more difficult. As a desert child, he'd never needed to worry about that with his sand, but as he spent more time in damper terrain, he realized the truth of Oniki's words. He had learned early on that earth chakra had advantage over water chakra, but the precise details of this advantage hadn't ever been told to him. Earth didn't eliminate water, it absorbed it. A water jutsu would never be able to break a solid wall of earth, because the earth chakra would envelop the water chakra and create harmless mud. Each type of chakra had advantages, but those advantages could become disadvantages if one did not understand precisely how the advantages worked. Sakura was quite skilled at manipulating earth. She was not yet skilled at manipulating water. If the rain became too heavy, it might be difficult for her to tunnel out of the Uchiha compound, which in turn would risk her life. Gaara was a worrywart, this much he'd been told time and time again. But as the storm clouds gathered above the Yamanaka home, he couldn't help but feel like it was some kind of omen. Why do you think I never left the desert, kid? Gaara smiled at Shukaku's comment. True enough, Shukaku's raw earth power would be quite unhindered in a desert. Without the lightning and rain of storms, all that mattered was the quality of the earth and how well one could wield it. He was brought out of his thoughts by the soft clink of a teacup being sat down in front of him. The Yamanaka grew their own tea leaves, among the other countless herbs and flowers that helped make poultices and poisons for the Konoha shinobi. He would give credit where it was due, he didn't know a soul that made tea better than Ino. Gaara gratefully took a sip, and whatever Ino had brewed within caused a small flare within his chakra, which was appreciated. Maintaining transformed clones for long periods of time was exhausting, even for a Jinhiriki. Thankfully, inside the house, he no longer had to speak as Sakura, merely maintain her presence. The Umbu watching them couldn't hear through the walls, nor were they allowed to. Though smaller than the Nara complex, the Yamanakas were still a major Konoha clan, and listening in on anything within the walls was forbidden without clan permission. I heard that the shinobi from Omegakure arrived today, Ino announced as she sat down. The Omekage is a woman, apparently. Hinata said she was very pretty. Does it matter how pretty a Kage is? Sai asked. Beauty does not affect one's strength. Wrong. Ino shook her head. Do you know how many men have hesitated to hit me just because I'm a pretty girl? I've been on missions where I haven't gotten scratched once because men couldn't bear to harm my beautiful face. That's silly. Sai replied, turning back to his tea. If you were an enemy, I wouldn't hesitate. Ino only smirked at that. You say that now, but just wait until you see a pretty face on the battlefield. If you faced me down, I bet I could make you freeze with a single glance. Gaara decided not to mention that Sai was not most shinobi. He doubted Root would have allowed their soldiers to be influenced by something such as physical appearance. But as much as the conversation seemed like an argument, Sai and Ino had developed a strange sort of relationship where neither of them seemed fazed by the other's blunt commentary. It was probably good for Sai to have someone else he could be himself around. Even now, watching the two bicker, Gaara saw the beginnings of a smile on the boy's face. Which, of course, just made him wish that Sakura was here to see it, and as he thought of Sakura again all the worries came flooding back. Bathroom, he said simply, standing up and heading towards where he'd seen one passing by earlier. Not that he really needed to go, but he'd thought of something just now. Something that could help ease his worries. Maybe he couldn't go keep an eye on Sakura. But someone else could. He heard the patter of little footsteps following behind him. Emi was a smart tanuki, and as they reached the bathroom, Gaara gently shut the door behind them, then knelt down to talk to the tanuki directly. Emi, I need you to do something for me. The tanuki looked back at him, bright-eyed and paying attention. Good. Gaara dug into one of his pouches, pulling out a small scroll. Inside, Sai had sealed a couple of soldier pills, given to them courtesy of the Taki healers. They had been meant as supplements for Sakura as she'd recovered from chakra exhaustion, but since she hadn't needed them, he'd kept the scroll around just in case. He took out some thread and tied it around the scroll, then around Emi's neck until it was snug. Find Sakura. Don't be seen. He opened the bathroom door just enough so that the tanuki could slip through. He listened as the sound of scampering paws slowly receded into the distance. Maybe it was worrying too much. Maybe it was unnecessary. But Gaara was Sakura's protector, and that meant overthinking things, making sure that no possible threat could harm his friend. The rain fell harder, and Gaara thought briefly of praying to that strange god that Sakura always whispered to at night. Keep them safe. Tell us who you are. Shikamaru had also drawn a kunao, and the shinobi didn't show even an ounce of fear as he faced down the intruder in front of them. A trait Sakura needed to learn. The newcomer barely even turned to acknowledge Shikamaru, and it was so brief that Sakura almost missed it. Once the glance was done, the man kept his eye on Sakura and did not waver. I am a ghost. He answered simply. A ghost of the Uchiha clan, here to haunt these tragic grounds. I'd heard a very unusual tale from one Itaki Uchiha, about a girl who had been able to break the power of his Tsukuyomi. I simply wanted to see for myself if that was true. Itaka can be dramatic. Sakura wasn't sure how to answer that. If she admitted the truth, this man might want to see the claim tested. There were supposedly only 2 Uchiha left in the world, but Sakura had been doubting that claim for a while, and if this man was anything like she feared, he'd be just as capable as Itaka. On the other hand, if she claimed that she couldn't break the Tsukuyomi, the man might just try to test them anyway, to prevent them from finding whatever secrets lay here. She was stuck. So she might as well try to seem strong. You heard correctly. Itaki underestimated me. Itaki is used to being the strongest man in the room. Not even Orochimaru could see through his genjutsu. It is rare that he underestimates at all. The man leaned against the wall of the shrine. His casualness was perhaps even more unnerving than the fact that he was clearly a surviving Uchiha, or at least someone who possessed a Sharingan. Sakura's grip tightened on her blade. So. The man continued. You are claiming to be stronger than a member of the Sunin. I suppose you would have to be, to try and unite the world in such a way. There are already shinobi scheming against you. There will be no shortage of dissent. I'm already aware. Sakura countered. I'm not a fool. If you've just come here to give a lecture dash. I came to give an offer. The man stood forward, holding out a hand. My organization is short a member with Orochimaru's absence. And our goals are not so different, yours and mine. We both seek a world of peace. Your attempt at diplomacy will fail, as all attempts have failed time and time again. There will always be those whose selfishness outweighs their desire to cooperate. I, however, have a plan that is guaranteed success. I have a plan to end all wars and squabbles, all petty disagreements and bad blood. You can be a part of that plan. All it takes is a willingness to give up 9 insignificant lives for the preservation of thousands. Join with Akatsuki, Sakura Harano, and you shall be a true bringer of peace. There wasn't even a doubt in her mind or any hesitation. Sakura wasn't sure what delusion the man had convinced himself of, that the power of the Baijiryu could so easily bring peace, but, those lives were not insignificant to her. An Akatsuki was not and was never an option. "You don't know a thing about me, do you?" Sakura answered. "I won't spill innocent blood for peace, especially not the blood of those I consider my dearest friends. If you're Akatsuki, then we are enemies." "I see. It was worth an attempt. Now I shall have no grievances towards ending your life." In the blink of an eye, then man vanished. It was only a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that caused Sakura to turn, a primal instinct that forced her to raise her kunao in self-defense. As she turned, she saw the man appear again, and their kunao clashed together in a clang that echoed within the shrine. Sakura forced herself not to look the man in the eyes. She hadn't seen them clearly enough to know if he had a Sharingan, but it was not a risk she was willing to take. Instead, she focused downwards, confirming her visual before lifting her knee in an attempt to hit the man directly in the groin. The man simply vanished again, and this time she was slightly too slow to react. Shikamaru, however, was not. She heard a second clash of steel as Shikamaru moved to cover her back. Smart. If they covered each other, whatever strange teleportation the man was using couldn't catch them off guard. Two people meant no blind spots. What followed next was something akin to a dance. The man appeared and reappeared around them, lashing out with a kunao whenever he was close enough. Sometimes it was teleportation, but other times Sakura was convinced it was sheer speed. After a while, she was able to confirm it. There was a pattern to the attack. The teleportation took a set amount of time, about 3 seconds. If the man used the teleportation again directly after, there was a 5-second delay. If the man simply moved, there was no delay, and he arrived at his next point of attack within a second. Sakura was certain Shikamaru was seeing it too. With time, both of their movements became less desperate and more definitive. Sakura was no longer worried for her life, but instead trying to look for an opening. And just as she was certain she'd found one, just when she was ready to strike, the man stopped. He reappeared at the door again, looking just as nonchalant as before. As expected from a student of the copy ninja. As expected too from a child of the Nara. Your reflexes are quite keen. But I am not your only opponent tonight. If the Konoha patrols saw a battle happening on the sealed Uchiha grounds, I wonder what that would mean for the both of you. The man's hands began to move, and Sakura remembered all at once the second thing the Uchiha clan were known for, besides the infamous Sharingan. Fire-style jutsu. He was going to set the shrine on fire. And that would draw every shinobi in the village to investigate. She and Shikamaru would be caught, and everything she had worked for would be ruined, and this little shit could just teleport away and not have to face a single consequence. Sakura saw Shikamaru stretching his shadow towards the man, but it just wouldn't be quick enough. She had only one option, and that was to use a jutsu that she hadn't even remotely come close to mastering. One that Kakashi had sworn she could learn with time and patience, but right now she couldn't afford either of those things. She would have to master this technique now or else everything was over. Shikaka had once told her the secret to earth techniques was understanding the relationship between the natural earth energy around her and her own chakra. So too, Sakura deduced, would she have to understand water. There was no source of water nearby, but there was moisture in the air. She would have to inhale, merging the moisture with her own chakra, and expel it with enough force to counter whatever her enemy had planned. Most importantly, it required control. And that Sakura had. Her hands flew through the signs and she took a deep breath. She could feel her chakra writhing with the effort, clashing against the energy that it was not naturally drawn to form. She was earth, but now she had to be water, flowing and dancing and gushing forth against her opponent. Sakura felt a pressure build in her chest and mouth, and as soon as she saw the spark of fire in front of her, she let it spill forth. It was a pitifully small attempt. Her water bullet couldn't have been bigger than her fist. But Sakura had done one thing right, and that was aim. Her bullet flew through the air and slammed against man's mask, which was just enough distraction to stop him from expending more chakra and gave Shikamaru just enough time to connect his shadow with the man's own. Everyone froze, and for a moment that was all too brief, Sakura could breathe. "Ah!" the man commented. "How annoying." And then Sakura saw the air begin to shimmer around the man, originally from a spot near the eye hole in his mask, and in the blink of an eye the man had vanished yet again. Shit! Shikamaru, how did he dash? The man reappeared, this time directly behind Shikamaru. He quickly placed a hand on Shikamaru's shoulder, and before he could pull away, before Sakura could interfere, both of them vanished. When the man reappeared, alone, he made a gesture of wiping his hands together. I forgot how troublesome the Nara Shadow Jutsu can be. He won't interfere with our playtime anymore. Where did you take him? Sakura demanded. Another place. A place only I can reach. The man replied. He will likely die there of dehydration within the next day or two. That is the price one pays for moving against me. Then why not me too? Why not just leave there to die? Then there's no risk of my interference. The man hesitated, but by then Sakura had already managed to deduce the answer. You're afraid it won't work on me. You're afraid it won't work because it's a Sharingan technique, and if I can break out of Ataka's technique, you think I can break out of yours too. The man threw his hands together, once again going through the hand signs for a fire technique. Sakura matched it, and water clashed against the sparks of flame once, twice, a third time. But the man hadn't tried to use that technique on her, which meant she was right. What was assuredly an accidental fluke during her face-off with Ataki had now turned into her advantage. So long as he thought her capable of breaking Sharingan technique, he wasn't going to waste chakra trying. Which was all well and good, but that didn't solve the problem of the missing Shikamaru, and that didn't solve the problem of Sakura very clearly being outclassed. Even keeping up her own small water bullets was quickly draining her chakra, and every now and then the man would switch it up and once again go back to teleporting around the shrine, attempting to get in a stab with a sharpened kunai. Only this time, Sakura didn't have Shikamaru watching her back. It didn't take long before the man got lucky, and Sakura found her shoulder on the receiving end of a kunai. The pain was a distraction, and it meant her arm couldn't move as quickly as before. If this was to be an endurance fight, Sakura was going to lose. She needed Gaara and Sai, she needed Shikamaru, she needed someone, anyone. The man appeared in front of her, too quickly to react. He was aiming for the death blow, and Sakura couldn't move fast enough to keep him from putting a blade straight into her heart. A flash of brown fur moved into her line of sight, and suddenly Emi had slammed herself into the man's head, and they both went tumbling to the shrine floor. Sakura heard the man cry out as the tanuki sunk her teeth and claws into whatever she could get a grip on. The man vanished, but this only served to take Emi with wherever he'd gone to. There was a pause, and Sakura looked around wildly, putting her back against a wall while she tried to predict. In a flurry of movement, the man reappeared, this time with both Emi and Shikamaru in tow. Shikamaru had grabbed onto the man's arm, which had been just enough to be taken back with him when the man had returned. By the look of things, he'd managed to even stab a kunai into the man's arm to make sure, which meant the tides were changing. The man could be injured, and if people were taken to the man's other place, they could be retrieved. Of course, if they didn't move quickly, the man would just take them back again. Sakura couldn't let that happen. She reached for another kunai, this time pulling out the strange, three-pronged one that Kakashi had given her for her birthday. She wasn't as good at throwing it yet, but it was the only one she had left, and it wasn't about hitting him now, it was about keeping her friends safe. Emi, Shikamaru, move. Sakura let herself pour chakra into her arm and threw the kunai with everything she could muster. She saw Emi drop off and Shikamaru push himself away, and she half expected the man to simply teleport out of the way again, but then the kunai passed through the man, and the man suddenly turned around to face it, raising his hands up against what looked to Sakura to be an imaginary foe. He used these kunai for his Flying Thunder God technique. Kakashi's words rang in her head, and Sakura realized that the man not only recognized the kunai, but was distracted by it. She only had one chance, and this was it. She didn't have much, but Sakura pushed what little chakra she did have into her legs and let herself fly towards the man, fist at the ready. When the man turned around to face her once again, this time he wasn't quick enough to dodge her blow. Her fist connected with his mask, and she felt a satisfying crack as the mask shattered under her blow. The man skidded back, reaching up to clutch at his face as his protection crumbled away. Sakura caught a glimpse of the red of a Sharingan eye, but only the one, the other eye looked forcibly shut. And the man's skin, Sakura had never seen skin look so unnaturally two-toned, a mix of typical flesh and a strange, white color that seemed to remind Sakura of a corpse rather than something alive. Her eyes met his, and Sakura regretted it instantly, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. There was something about the way the man looked at her, something about how he looked that nagged at her mind and wouldn't let go. "Very well done." The man finally spoke. "Perhaps there will be use to keeping you alive after all." The man vanished, and this time he did not return. Sakura hadn't known that Shikamaru was capable as cursing as much as he was currently doing. They'd made their way beneath the Uchiha shrine, but even as they'd searched through nearly dozen shelves of scrolls, Shikamaru continued to curse without hardly taking a breath between them. "I cannot believe I let you drag me into something so fucking out of our league. This is such a fucking drag. He dragged me to another fucking dimension, Sakura." Sakura was only half paying attention to the rant. In one hand, she was scanning scrolls, trying not to let herself linger too long on clan secrets that she had no right to. Her other hand was carefully scratching Emi's back. No doubt Gaara had sent her as backup, and she was going to give that boy the biggest hug when she got back to Enos. As for Emi, Sakura would be giving her as many treats as the Tanuki wanted for the next month. "All I ever wanted to do was be an average fucking shinobi with an average fucking life. Retire early, start a family, never have to worry about anything this fucking insane." Sakura wondered, briefly, if Shikamaru's time with Ino was beginning to rub off on him. Or even Naruto, though Sakura had never heard him curse, but Naruto was capable of talking for hours if allowed. Maybe he'd also started rubbing off on the Nara. "We are going to fucking die doing this, Sakura. If Danzo doesn't kill us, then whoever the fuck that is certainly will, once he's gotten over the shock of you getting a damned lucky hit." Whoever it was, Sakura knew. Sakura couldn't deny it. Either that, or it was going to be a hell of a coincidence. One cherry non-eye. Similar age to Kakashi. A warped body. Sakura couldn't deny that there was a high possibility that this man was Kakashi's lost teammate. Obito Uchiha. She wasn't sure how. She wasn't even sure why, though if Obito had gotten wrapped up in the Akatsuki, all that meant at the end of the day was that he was the enemy. 1,000 questions were already trying to worm their way through her, but Sakura was much too tired to process any of them. She didn't want to deal with this. In a way, she agreed with Shikamaru. This was way out of their league. Son of a bitch, Sakura. Did the cursing help? Yeah, maybe a little. Shikamaru made his way over to Sakura's side, bending over to pick Emi up in his arms. He began to stroke her back, and the Tanuki made happy little purrs as she settled. "If you hadn't shown up, I'd still be stuck in that weird dimension. So tomorrow we're going to Chuji's favorite barbecue and you're getting whatever the hell you want, alright?" Emi let out a small chirp, and Sakura couldn't help but smile in relief. They were alright somehow. She'd fought another Uchiha and lived. Maybe Oniki was right. Maybe the Uchiha weren't the gods she'd made them in her head, simply just shinobi with a very powerful tool. A tool that could be learned. A tool that could be fought against. If someone stronger than her had faced this man, they could have easily gotten the upper hand, assuming they figured out the gimmick to the teleportation technique. Sakura's hand went to her side, to the three-pronged kunao. The man had known the fourth Hokage's signature technique, and not only that, had feared it. As if he'd faced it before. Shikamaru. Yeah. You can't tell anyone about him. Wait, why? Don't you think it's important to at least tell the other rookies? Yes, but not yet. Not until I know more. If the wrong information gets out, it might cause problems. Which means you have theories about who that guy is. Theories that involve people we know. Sakura nodded, absent-mindedly reaching for another scroll. For now, our enemy is Danzo. Once Danzo is finished, then I can let myself think about Akatsuki. Then I can let myself think about him. He might show up again. Not if we never come back here, he won't. Not in the village proper. He doesn't want to be seen. That's why he left once the mask was broken. He didn't want to risk me putting things together. Too bad for him, it seems like you already have. I think he underestimated what someone was willing to tell me. Sakura opened the scroll, and her eyes widened as she took in its contents. This was it. She shoved the scroll in Shikamaru's direction, letting him look it over. Battle plans. Revolution plans. Sakura confirmed. Meeting notes. There's several that look like it's still here on the shelf. You were right, Shika. The Uchiha were planning an uprising. You were right. I'm starting to hate being right all the time. Shikamaru admitted. Grab all of those. We should get out of here before it gets too late. You took that soldier pill, right? Right. Sakura nodded. It had been a lifesaver, another thing she'd have to thank Gaara for. Without it, she might not have had enough chakra to tunnel themselves out again. Gaara was getting good at looking ahead, seeing the worst and preparing for it. Sakura wished she could talk with Gaara about Obito. But for now, it was a secret she'd have to keep until she knew how to address. If she was right, Obito Uchiha was alive, was currently a part of Akatsuki, and, if her worst fears were true, he had been the orchestrating mind behind the Kyuubi attack at Naruto's birth. And somehow, this man believed that it was all for the sake of peace. Sakura shivered as she pulled scrolls from the shelf. Would she hit a point, soon, where this would become too much? Akatsuki was so much more terrifying than even she'd initially thought. She'd gotten stronger, but it still wasn't enough. She still needed a Tanuki to come and save her in her most desperate moment. She still had to be rescued after all this time. Never again, she'd promised herself. Never again would she be the weak link. This wasn't just about her. This was about the world, and this was about saving it. This was about doing what she'd read about in fantastical tales about superhuman shinobi. This was about doing what made up myths and legends. It was too much for her, it was too much for anyone. But nobody else was going to do it. Nobody else was this entrenched, nobody else had taken action. It was her that had spurred Shikamaru to look into Root. It was her that had taken up Onaki's offer to strive for peace. It was her, all those months ago, that had run from this very village because she couldn't allow herself to do nothing. Sakura wondered if the heroes of her stories had even been superhuman at all. Maybe a hero was just the kind of person that moved when no one else would. We're going to do it, Shikamaru. She insisted. It doesn't matter that it's out of our league. We're going to do it because no one else will. Shikamaru just looked at her, half pouting as he pulled Emi close. Girls are such a drag, aren't they, Emi? You realize Emi is a girl too, right? Oh man. Chapter 48. It was still raining when they returned to Ino's, which worked well enough for them. Sakura disguised herself as a small book. Shikamaru passed her on to Ino under the guise of returning it, and without much more effort Sakura was back amongst her companions and no longer under threat of discovery. They had taken 4 scrolls from the Uchiha compound in total, all of which Shikamaru had decided to keep for now. It would be better that way, Sakura had agreed. Shikamaru was the one orchestrating this now, and it was better if he knew all the cards he'd be playing with. She did her best to hide her stab wound from the others, as well as the few cuts she'd received. It would probably be impossible to hide it from the boys later, but for now there was no point in making them worry more than they had that night. Sakura could have sworn she even saw relief on Sai's face when she'd materialized in the room, and if it had been bad enough a scenario to make him worry. Well, it didn't matter now. She was back, they were safe, and once the 3 of them had gotten home, Sakura could allow herself some much-needed sleep. Though, of course, it was hard to sleep when there was so much to think about. The worst part was not being able to voice her thoughts, not yet. The next time she'd be able to would be the next time they met the group at the Nara compound, and Shikamaru hadn't wanted to draw suspicion with them meeting there too frequently. It would be another week before the group met again, which meant that until then, Sakura was locked in her own thoughts. Gaara and Sai both picked up on this, and while Sai was used to letting secrets lie, Sakura could tell it was frustrating Gaara to no end. All she could give him for hints was paying Emi some special attention and giving Gaara that promised hug once they'd returned home. It was enough, Sakura figured, to give him a small bit of relief, but she knew questions would be weighing on the boy's mind until the next week. The next day was perhaps the most stressful. Sakura was summoned for a meeting with Tsunade in the early morning, and the last thing Sakura wanted was for the renowned medical genius to notice she was holding her arm a bit stiffly and to ask how she'd gotten so prominently injured in the 2 days she'd been in Konoha. She wrapped her wound as tightly as she could justify, and made a note to herself to just move her arms as little as possible. Tsunade didn't know her mannerisms. Tsunade wasn't looking for an injury. She would be okay as long as she kept it together. As it turned out, Sakura hadn't needed to worry. There were plenty of other distractions to keep the Hokage occupied, first and foremost being the Amekage. Sakura recognized her immediately as the woman she'd seen on the rooftops 2 nights prior, though she had heard from her mother that the AIM group had supposedly only arrived yesterday. Sakura didn't linger too much on that thought. AIM and Konoha had been at war in the past, and this was perhaps the first time the 2 villages had interacted on peaceful terms since then. That the Amekage might want to scout out the state of the village before allowing her shinobi to enter was probably just healthy suspicion. Seeing her in the light, Sakura had to admit that the woman really was beautiful. She'd never seen such a lovely shade of blue for hair, and the woman had decorated her hair with what looked to be an origami flower, far more intricate than anything Sakura had made in her childhood. Otherwise, the woman dressed simply, wearing a long black overcoat that was likely more for strategy than appearance. She could be hiding any manner of weapon or scroll beneath it, and most would be none the wiser. This was a woman that screamed not only elegance, but competence. Sakura, this is Konan, the current leader of Omegacore. Tsunade introduced them. She came to me expressing a desire to speak with you personally. About the treaty, I am assuming. Sakura gave the woman a polite bow. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have, but I had been planning on organizing a meeting with all the Kage prior to the start of the exams, so I wouldn't have to repeat myself as much. I see. Konan replied. I would still wish to speak with you in private, just you and I, if you do not mind. Tsunade assured me she could provide a place where we would not be disturbed. Of course. Sakura shot a glance back to Gaara and Sai, knowing Gaara hated her going off on her own again. It seemed such scenarios were becoming inevitable. Please lead the way. There were a plethora of conference rooms in the building, and most were decorated with seals meant to prevent those outside from listening in. Sakura wasn't sure how well she trusted such seals. If they were Konoha made, then Konoha shinobi could learn how to maneuver around them, Root in particular. Still, it wasn't as though she was going to be discussing anything that sensitive with the Amekage. Sakura was fairly certain that Konan just didn't want them to be disturbed. They sat, and for a while both of them were silent. Sakura watched as Konan's eyes glanced throughout the room, looking towards each wall and the ceiling. Then, Konan lifted her hand. From her sleeve, paper birds fluttered out, causing Sakura to draw a kunao in defense. The birds, however, flew straight past her, flattening into long strips against the various walls. Sakura saw seals written on each of them, and once they had all been positioned, she felt a heavy aura of chakra fill the room. I do not trust Konoha seals. Konan admitted aloud. But I do trust my own. Now we may speak freely. Paper, Sakura's mind noted. This Amekage was good with seals, but her origami creations were a jutsu all their own, something she'd never seen before. Much like Sai's art came to life, so too did Konan's. Sakura lamented briefly that Sai wasn't here to see it for himself. Maybe in the future, maybe if things ever reached peace, the two could learn from each other. All right. What did you want to speak to me about? Many things. When I first heard of you, I was curious, you see. Your mission, your purpose, it is familiar to me. Familiar. You could say that in the past, you and I would have been very similar. Konan leaned forward in her chair, now looking Sakura dead on. How much do you know of AIM's history? She asked. I know you are Konoha born, so I have no doubt what you know will be peppered by propaganda. Don't forget, I've also studied under the Tsuchikage. Sakura countered. What I know is that in the aftermath of the First Shinobi War, 3 major countries attempted to expand their territories, and as a result ended up clashing over AIM's lands. There's, admittedly, disparity on who started the war. Konoha says Iwa and Suna. Iwa says Konoha and Suna. In Aim's case, I assume it did not matter. There was war over your land, and your people suffered for it. Yes. Konan agreed. It was a very disturbing time. It did not matter to us which shinobi came from where. All outsiders treated us the same. Aim shinobi were not spared. Aim civilians were not spared. It was during this time, when I was but a child, that I was orphaned and left to die. Sakura couldn't help but wince. Stories like those were not uncommon in the shinobi world, but that didn't make them easier to hear. I eventually came into the company of 2 others like myself, and we learned to protect each other to survive. But it was not enough. We knew it would never be enough. 3 orphan children, attempting to survive a shinobi war? We needed to learn jutsu to survive. We needed a teacher. And in time, we found one. Tsunade likely does not remember it, but she was there when we did. She was there, because by chance we happened upon the Konoha Sunin in the aftermath of battle. It was then and there that we convinced the shinobi Jiraiya to be our teacher, and for 2 years we studied as his pupils. Sakura couldn't help but look shocked. This woman had studied under Jiraiya? Jiraiya was here in the village, had he seen her and known? Perhaps felt pride in his old student for becoming a leader? Once our training was complete, my friends and I had a goal. We would stop the war. We would stop all wars. We would work for peace, not only for Omegakure, but for all shinobi villages. We founded a group, and the 3 of us grew in strength and numbers until one day we caught the attention of Lord Hanzo, who sent us word that he was interested in cooperating with our mission. Konan closed her eyes, taking a breath before continuing. It was a lie, of course. We were ambushed, and all of our group were slaughtered save for myself and 1 other of my friends. It was then that we learned the truth of this world. There is no desire for peace. The people in it, they are selfish, and desire only their own self-preservation. In our wanting of a peaceful world, my friend and I were outcasts. Strangers. And if we did not face the world the way it wanted, if we did not approach violence with strength, we would never see peace. So my friend and I raised a rebellion. We took back control of AIM from Hanzo. And in these following years we have trained and grown strong enough to defend our borders from even those countries that are considered the 5 great countries. And now here I stand, a Mekage, looking upon someone that looked as I did all those years ago. So, you think I'm naive? Sakura questioned. For trying to make this treaty work. No, Konan replied. I think you are human. To want a peaceful world is a selfish desire, even if such a thing would benefit all. You want a world that is safe for the ones that you love, and you are aiming for it in a way that is logical. There is no need to worry if the countries are put into a position where they never need be at war again. But I have seen the worst that can come from attempting such things. You are Konoha born, and you are hope for your generation. In speaking with you now, I hope to repay my debt to Jiraiya, for giving us strength all those years ago. That is why I must insist that you temporarily put a halt to your goal of uniting the shinobi world. Temporarily. Sakura frowned at this. I can't temporarily put a stop to things, I'm already in the thick of it. I came here to Konoha at this time so I could speak with as many Kage as possible. I'd be stupid not to take advantage. There are already forces moving against you, Sakura. The same forces that moved against myself. Hanzo was not alone when he betrayed us. There were others who wanted my organization dead. Others who profited from war, thrived in it. Others who are watching you and I even now, looking for weaknesses and openings to tear you apart. Those others. Wait. Sakura held up a hand. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that things were this involved, all this time, in so many places. Please, Lady Konan, please don't tell me this has to do with Danzo Shimura. This time, it was Konan who looked surprised. Then, suddenly, a small smile grew on her face. Ah. So, you are already aware. Crap, Sakura let herself moan. I could write a book on the number of conspiracies this man's been named in. I don't have room for another one. But, wait, do you have proof? Testimonies of dead men. Konan admitted. Nothing that would be of use to you. But that you already know of how dangerous that man is gives me a small bit of hope. It is he who persuaded Hanzo to turn against us. He who indirectly led to the death of people that I cherished. Then I think you and I are going to get along just fine. Sakura replied. Danzo has many things he needs to answer for. He has already approached me. He, too, does not remember my involvement in AIM's history, or perhaps did not know who I was at the time. He desired my alliance. He claimed that Konoha had grown weak, and if my people aided him in Konoha's resurrection, we could stand to benefit. He offered us land. Offered us trade. I have no doubt he will be extending that offer to every cage that has not yet signed your treaty. That meant Suna, Kusa, Tani, 3 other villages that had potential to be turned against her treaty. Shikamaru had hinted that Danzo was moving against her, but this wasn't just about her. Danzo was planning a goddamned civil war. You haven't accepted his offer. I will not work with that man. But that doesn't imply that you are willing to work with me, either. No, it does not. Konan stood up. But if I am here for anything, Sakura, I am here to see what it is you offer this world. You can consider it your one and only chance to catch my attention. Konan made her way to the wall, reaching out for her paper seals. Sakura spoke up before she could pull it down. Testify for me? Konan turned to face her. Sakura could feel her heart pounding in her chest. It was something, and she had to try for it. Testify for your people. I'm doing everything I can to bring Danzo down, but if you testify for me that Danzo interfered in your village and instigated unnecessary death, your words will have weight. You could be the final piece we need. Please, Lady Konan, I'm begging you to testify. There was a pause. Then, Konan pulled down her paper, going from wall to retrieve her seals before making her way to the door. It was pleasant speaking with you, Sakura Harino. She left, and once again Sakura was left alone with her thoughts. It was still raining gently as Sakura left the building. A small part of her wondered if the rain was tied to Konan. It was said to always be raining in Megakure, and ever since the AIM contingent arrived, it had rained almost non-stop. It was Naruto who escorted them from the Hokage's office, under the stated guise of practicing being a good host. Tsunade had seen right through it, Sakura was sure, but she also knew Tsunade was kind enough to the boy to allow him some time to spend with his friends. Sakura was admittedly grateful to have Naruto around as a distraction. He brought a smile to Gaara's face, and even though he and Sai bickered near constantly, Sakura got the feeling that the two were growing on each other. Feeling hungry, Sakura offered to take the 3 of them to Ichiraku, and Naruto jumped at the opportunity. It was a short walk to the quaint little stand, and from there Sakura got to see the familiar image of Naruto stuffing himself with bowl after bowl of his favorite. Are you nervous about the exams? Sakura asked him once he'd slowed down. I mean, the last time the exams happened, there was a lot of other stuff. Next to her, she noticed a somewhat guilty look pass over Gaara's face. Well, it's not gonna be like last time, is it? Naruto pointed out. I'm way stronger than I was then, and Ino and Chuji and I have been practicing for weeks now. We're gonna be the strongest team there, you better believe it. And especially with you cheering me on, you know? If you guys are watching me, there's no amount of butt I won't be able to kick. You know I'll be cheering you on. Sakura patted Naruto's back. But I have to do it quietly. I'm not supposed to be showing favoritism towards anyone in any village. Quiet's fine. I know you'll still be rooting for me. Naruto replied with a grin. I have a ton of cool new moves to show off. But, you still owe me a spar, you know. You promised in your letter, don't think I've forgotten. How about after you've gotten your Chiryunin vest? Sakura offered. That way I'll get to be surprised by your cool new moves when I'm watching the exams. I guess. Naruto pouted. Alright, but you can't put it off after that, okay? After I've kicked everyone's butt at the exams, you better not hold back on me. You know I won't, Naruto. Good. Naruto kept up a smile for a little while longer, but eventually Sakura saw a hint of sadness in his eyes. The boy turned back to his ramen, poking around at the meat with his chopsticks. Do you think he's gotten stronger too, Sakura. He didn't have to say it. Sakura knew he was thinking about Sasuke. Definitely. She answered honestly. Under Orochimaru, he'd have to be getting stronger. Strong enough to beat Orochimaru. I don't know. You're going to have to go that way eventually, aren't you, Sakura? For that treaty. So you'll be able to check on him, right? If Orochimaru lets you in. That's a lot of big ifs, Naruto. Sakura admitted with a sigh. Trust me, I want to be able to see how Sasuke's doing, but Orochimaru knows I'm his old teammate. If I show any sign of trying to take Sasuke away from him, he'll probably try to kill me. And if he doesn't try to kill me, that'll pretty much destroy any chance I have of getting Otogakure on the treaty. And why should we let them join the treaty? Naruto suddenly argued. They attacked us. Orochimaru killed the old man. And we've warred with Iwa and Suna in the past. Sakura countered. We've killed their shinobi, they've killed ours. This isn't about past grudges. It's about what's best for everyone. There's no way Orochimaru is ever going to join. Then I'll have tried. That's all I can do, Naruto, and you know I have to try. Even if all I get out of it is just seeing that Sasuke is okay, I have to try to talk with Orochimaru about the pact. Naruto huffed, shoving a particularly large piece of meat into his mouth. Sakura was amused to see that his eating habits hadn't much improved since she'd left. Sakura, I don't think Sasuke is ever going to come home. It was the last thing Sakura expected to hear out of Naruto's mouth. And she didn't want to agree with him. Sasuke meant just as much to Naruto as he had to her, maybe even more at this point. Sakura didn't feel that sinking, dreadful feeling when she thought of Sasuke anymore, but Naruto, at the mere mention of the name, had blown up as he always had. Naruto. But there's somewhere else he could go to be safe. Someone else he could go to. He could go with you, Sakura, don't you think? You're trying to bring peace, but you're also trying to warn everyone about Akatsuki. His brother is in Akatsuki. You could help him kill his brother, and then he could stay with you and be an ambassador. You'll ask him, won't you? You've gotta ask him. Alright, I'll ask him. Sakura protested. You don't have to tell me twice. I'll need more ambassadors anyway, if he's willing to join then you know he'll be welcome. But Sakura could almost feel in her gut what Sasuke would tell her if she'd dared ask. The Sasuke she saw last had only cared about one thing, one goal. Sakura had gotten stronger in her pursuit of peace, but would Sasuke see that? Still, with the way Naruto was looking at her, pleading, she couldn't disappoint her old teammate. Her old friend. I'll ask him. She promised, putting a hand on his shoulder. No matter what, I'll make sure he knows he has options. So don't worry about him, alright? You have exams to worry about. Yeah. Naruto agreed after a moment, nodding. Yeah, I've got exams. Days passed. Sakura began work on her speech, what she'd use to try and persuade the visiting cages once she could gather them for a meeting. She knew now, thanks to Konan, that she was competing with Danzo for these villages' allegiance, and if she didn't sway enough of them, it could lead to another war. Sakura longed to be able to tell Tsunade about the risk, but the more she admitted, the more questions would be asked. Instead, she used her connection to Naruto to her advantage, giving Naruto advice on village security that he could in turn present to Tsunade as his idea. It served to gain him some favor with his sensei, and helped put Sakura's mind at ease. If it did came to some sort of scrap, Konoha would already be far more prepared. The medical corps had been bolstered under Tsunade's rule, and their civilian evacuation protocols updated. Plus, Sakura knew for sure that there would be 3 villages fighting on her behalf. There was no way Oniki would turn on her, not after helping spearhead the project. Plains more than owed her a favor. And Waterfall wasn't in this for power or land. She doubted Danzo would be able to sway Shibuki, not when it had taken Shukaku to sway him before. She knew nothing of the grass and river villages, but Sakura did know Suna. They resented her for stealing their Jinchuriki, and Sakura had no doubt that they would be the hardest to sway to her cause. All Sakura could hope was that she had the right words to make them realize that she hadn't stolen their Jinchuriki had willingly left, and was now working for their sake as much as everyone else's. She wasn't sure who the new Kazekage was, but whoever it was, Sakura couldn't help but worry. Suna was one of the great villages, and if Danzo ensured an alliance, that would be an enemy to be fearful of. If Danzo could sway grass and river to his cause as well, the scales, at least, would be perfectly balanced. One great village, two smaller villages, and half of Konoha on each side. Sakura knew that Konan wouldn't stand with Danzo, but she might choose simply to not pick a side. But, if Sakura managed to get just one of the three villages on her side, or in a perfect world, all three, then the scales would tip in their favor, and Danzo would be less likely to risk war. She had to move quickly and decisively to prevent bloodshed, all without letting any side know that she'd caught on to the game. Shikamaru had likely already put much of this together, but Sakura had yet to figure out his final cryptic hint. Danzo, or someone he'd swayed, was going to ask her to do something, and Shikamaru wanted her to go through with it. She didn't have a clue what it was Danzo could want from her, or why Shikamaru would want it to, but the thoughts weighed heavy on her mind as the Chiryunin exams drew closer and closer. She spent her days training, mostly with Lee and his team. There was nothing wrong with getting herself in shape, in case the worst happened, and now that she was physically present, that meant Lee could show her some of his more advanced physical training. That alone was enough to keep her mind focused. While she ran, while she punched and kicked, while she did anything physical, it gave her time to think about her speech and the days to come. It was during her second week in Konoha when the other villages began to arrive. It was Suna that reached them first, and like many others in the village, Sakura made her way to the front gate to greet the group as they arrived. It was the first time they would be seeing the new Kazekage, and Sakura wanted to see firsthand who one of her future opponents would be. Life didn't like to make itself easy for her. Sakura knew she'd gotten lucky in the past, but now it seemed her luck had finally begun to turn around. How else would it have come to pass that Gaara's sister was given the title Kazekage? Temari had been a scary girl even when Sakura had first seen her a year ago. But that was nothing compared to how Temari looked at her and Gaara now, sending off enough loathing and killing intent to make her shiver. There was no way she was going to be able to persuade Temari, not when things were oh so personal for her. Gaara was her brother and the village Jinhiriki. Temari was the one who had put her trust in Sakura, and Sakura had broken that trust. "We're fucked," Sakura whispered to her companions. "We're doomed," Gaara agreed. "Glad to know the two of you finally agree with me," Sai added, his fake smile contrasting to their downtrodden faces. Sakura couldn't even find the energy to quip back. As far as she saw it now, Suna was in Danzo's hands. If she couldn't sway grass and river to her way of thinking, war was inevitable. "Shikamaru, I hope you know what you're doing." Chapter 49. It had now been raining for 2 weeks straight. Sakura couldn't help but take it as a bad sign. She'd never seen so much rain in Konoha in all her life, and even though it came down softly, it never seemed to stop. Sakura had gotten used to walking around her village with a light layer of Gaara's sand above them, though even Gaara admitted that he had to cycle his sand constantly to prevent it from becoming a shower of mud. Sakura remembered hearing that it was constantly raining in Megakure, which made sense, given the name, and she wondered at times if it was Konan's influence. Either way, the rain made everything seem far more depressing. It hadn't all been bad, however. Eventually Oniki arrived and she was able to greet her old sensei again, as well as bring him up to speed with all that had happened since she'd left him. Not quite everything, of course, but what had happened in Taki was not a secret at this point. It had brought her a bit of comfort to hear Oniki laugh over her encounter with Itake. He'd patted her on the back and simply told her, as expected of my student. His confidence in her, even now, was something of a grounding point. Perhaps one of the few grounding points she had as she prepared to speak with 8 of the most important shinobi on the continent. The Chiryunin exams were due to begin the day after her meeting with the Kage. Watching her friends train for the affair was a decent enough distraction, especially once she really saw how Naruto, Ino, and Chuji worked as a team under Shikamaru's lead. Sakura saw Naruto in a way she had never seen him before, effortlessly working back-to-back with a team that he trusted with his life. It brought almost a dull ache to her heart. In all her time with Naruto and Sasuke on Team 7, they'd never worked so flawlessly. Maybe it was inevitable that they had grown apart. Had Sasuke found a team of his own in Otagakure, others that had gotten more attached to in his time away from Konoha? Or had he wallowed in isolation, so far gone in Orochimaru's influence that he didn't even recognize anymore what it was like to have friends? She would bring Root to justice. And then she would see for herself what Sasuke had become. On the day of her meeting, Sakura wore her armor. Not to intimidate, but to show, on some level, that she was capable. She had nothing else to bring with her to the meeting but her reputation and her words, and though word had spread of her ability to face down Itachi Uchiha and live, she had no doubt word had spread of her other deeds. Aiding a Suna rebellion, stealing the Suna Jinchuriki, all things she would have to justify, or else hope could be spoken around. At the very least, she looked the part of a kunoichi. No one would be able to say that a timid little girl was walking into this meeting. Sakura, nerves aside, would walk with her head held high. She was an ambassador, a student of the Tsuchikage, and the girl who undid the Sharingan. She prayed to whatever god might be listening that it would be enough. There was a building, sequestered away from Konoha proper and buried beneath layers of security. There were more seals than Sakura had ever seen in her life, and more Umbu guards than she'd known existed in the village. The building itself consisted only of a single room, and inside was a large, round table. Here the cage could sit and discuss as equals. Sakura was not allowed in at first. There were formalities to uphold, especially as two of the cage were newly elected and another of the cage hadn't ever met with the others before. Introductions needed doing, as well as a bit of time to clear the air. Sand and Plains were one step away from being at war with each other, and Sakura could only hope that they could make a bit of progress on their own before she was forced into the lion's den. Sakura took her time to go over each cage in her mind, and what she knew. Oniki was perhaps the one she knew the most about. He would be an ally, but he also had appearances to maintain. If she spoke stupidly, he wouldn't defend her. If she acted out of place, he would not intervene. Oniki had spearheaded this project, but he wasn't foolish. This was Sakura's chance to rise or fall, and he wasn't going to push or pull either way. Shibuki was firmly in her court, but Sakura had promises to uphold. She would have to speak up for the rights of the Byakuya, for better treatment of Jinchuriki, or else Taki would withdraw. It wouldn't be difficult to bring the topic up, but Sakura knew it would be met with resistance. Tsunade also had held her to a promise. Sakura would bring up various medical proposals, as well as tentatively breach the subject of higher age standards for genin. That would definitely be met with resistance, but Sakura would keep her word. Tsunade hadn't insisted these demands be met immediately, only that they be pushed for consistently, and that Sakura could do. Satomi, the new leader of Plains, already stood in her court as well. Sakura realized she had a bit of leverage over Plains, seeing as she helped put Satomi in charge, which meant that Satomi really couldn't speak out against her. Konan was an enigma, but Sakura knew enough to at least guarantee that Konan would not align herself with Danzo. In terms of the neutrality pact, however, Sakura still had no idea where Rain stood. It was just as likely that she would join as it was that she would decline, but even if her decline wouldn't hurt Sakura now, it might help dissuade others from getting on board. And that left those other three cage that Sakura had to sway. Temari was likely to be the biggest problem. Gaara, despite being her brother, did not know her as well as Sakura would have liked, but that could be blamed on the fact that Gaara hadn't really been close to anyone before Sakura. What Gaara did know was that Temari was ruthless in her own way, and more than capable of holding a grudge. The only reason that Sand had stayed allied with Leaf was because Sand believed reparations were owed due to Orochimaru infiltrating them and forcing them to war. In any other scenario, if any other shinobi were with her, Sakura knew Sand would likely have no issue agreeing to the pact. But because it was her and Gaara, it was now personal with Suna, and even more personal with Temari. Takeshi was the next problem. The Grass Village shinobi were known for being shrewdly diplomatic, and at first Sakura had hoped that they would take to the pact because of this. But she had learned in her readings that when a village referred to something as diplomatic, they more often than not meant manipulative. Grass was a small village, often the site of war whenever the larger countries got into spats, and had learned to wield their words as weapons so that they could play ally to both sides and come out with less damage for it. Even if she could sway Takeshi to her side, Sakura couldn't be certain he wasn't also playing nice with Danzo. Finally came Agano of the village hidden in valleys. An alliterative mouthful to be sure, and due to this the village was just as often referred to as the River Village, for that was the country in which the village resided. The village was known for being turncoat when it benefited them most, and all Sakura knew of Agano was that he was a shrew of a man, and that no outsider could trust his word to be true. So Sakura was against two Kage who were just as likely to turn on her as join with her, and one Kage who hated her guts. A lion's den indeed. As she finished going through her thoughts, an Umbu approached her, and it was time. With Gaara and Sai at her flank, Sakura allowed herself to be escorted into the room. All eyes were on her as she approached, and Sakura could see from just a glance that tensions were already high. Tsunade had the look on her face that she'd often got when Naruto was a bit too rambunctious around her, and Onaki's frown appeared as though it had been permanently chiseled onto his face. Excellent. Just excellent. There were 3 open chairs at the table, but Sakura did not allow herself to sit yet. Formalities, she had to remember formalities. She bowed deeply towards the center of the table, towards all of the Kage and yet none specifically. Good afternoon. My name is Sakura Harino and I am here to speak with each of you regarding my neutrality project. Silence, briefly. Then, from one of them, laughter. Sakura recognized the man as Agano, who really did look like a shrew of a man at a closer glance. He was older, perhaps Tsunade's age, and wore deep blue garments that Sakura had learned were the official village colors. She could see all manner of weaponry on the man's person. River had a village known as the Takumai village, and it was well known for exporting high-quality shinobi gear. It made sense that the region's leader would also be properly outfitted. This is the one. Agano finally spoke, still shaking with laughter as he did so. This pipsqueak here is Onaki's disciple? This must be some sort of joke. She looks like a light breeze might blow her over. There was chuckling from the man next to him, who had to be Takeshi. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and otherwise wore nondescript black clothing. He was a man who gave off the impression of not wanting to stand out, to blend in, and with how he mimicked Agano, that only confirmed Sakura's impression. Tamari too seemed amused by Agano's declaration, and the other Kage in the room remained silent, waiting for her to respond. Sakura took a deep breath, but before she could speak up, someone else did. If you are simply here to trade petty insults, then you might as well not be here at all. I had thought Kage were supposed to be above such behavior. To Sakura's surprise, Sai had been the one to speak up, all the while keeping up that serene fake smile she had come to associate with him. She watched as Agano sputtered, clearly not expecting such a blunt statement out of the boy. How dare dash. Quiet. Gaara spoke up next, his voice taking on a deep echo that seemed to fill the entire room. Sakura is speaking now. Sakura couldn't see how Gaara looked now, but she knew firsthand how intimidating the Jinhiriki could be. Whatever Agano saw on Gaara's face, it was enough to quiet him. Out of the corner of her eye, Sakura saw a smirk growing on Onaki's face. This was okay. She wasn't doing this alone. Gaara and Sai had apparently each decided to take on their own roles in full. They were ambassadors as well. They had just as much voice as she. Sakura took a deep breath and sat down. All right. Shall I begin with outlining the tenets of the treaty? Sakura had practiced her speech until she could recite it in her sleep. She started with the necessity of peace. War had not been kind to any country, and further spats in the future would only ever be to the village's detriment. She made sure to mention exterior threats too. Akatsuki was the most major of these threats, and Sakura believed it was paramount to her argument to emphasize that Akatsuki was full of S-ranked shinobi who were actively seeking out Baijuya. She could name at least half of them and describe what they were capable of, thanks to her own experiences and information provided about Kakuzu and Zetsu from Shibuki. If the villages remained in uneasy division, it would be all too easy for an organization like Akatsuki to pull them apart and seize control for themselves. Interestingly, Konan seemed the most interested in what Sakura had to say about Akatsuki. She took down notes and questioned her extensively, and of course every Kage listened intently when Sakura described her confrontation with Itachi. Sakura had made the decision early on to not let on to her ignorance as to how she escaped attack as genjutsu. She simply made the claim that she had a knack for breaking genjutsu, and while a Sharingan was intimidating, it was not unbeatable. She had come to the conclusion that appearing more confident on the matter than she was would only serve to benefit her. There was the matter of the Taki demons too, and while several of the people present scoffed at first, their attitudes changed when Shibuki offered to let any of them examine one of the captive demons that he had brought with him to Konoha. That, the cage would have to do on their own time, and Sakura hoped that being able to see that the demons were real would help further her own cause. From there, Sakura went into the details of the pact. There were core tenets which would apply to every village that signed on, as well as the possibility for addendums. This was the moment that Sakura chose to bring forth the amendments that Shibuki and Tsunade had insisted upon. She started first with Tsunade's. The idea of sharing medical knowledge across villages was an appealing one, especially to the smaller villages who likely did not have as much medical support. Raising the age standard for genin was a statement that was met with a couple of scoffs, as well as a direct protest from Temari. Under those laws, I wouldn't be Kage. A shinobi is an adult from the moment they are able to represent their village. If you are worried about fighting children, perhaps it is because you are worried what losing to a child would do to your village's reputation. I don't worry about losing to children. I worry about the permanent damage that can be inflicted upon a child's stability due to undergoing the stresses of war at a critical age. Big words from you, Leaf Princess. Agano retorted. Was it not true that until quite recently you fell apart at the mere sight of blood? And yet here you stand, now head of your village. Clearly the effects on one's psyche are not as severe as you would have us believe. Sakura could practically see Tsunade's blood boiling at this. It was a clever move on Agano's parts. It not only dismissed the pact, but also threw doubt over Tsunade's capability as a Hokage. There was an implication beneath the words that Tsunade could still fall apart at the sight of blood. There was no way of truly knowing she had recovered yet. Sakura spoke before Tsunade could be drawn into a fist fight. At this moment in time, Lord Agano and Lady Temari, your opinions do not matter on this addendum. Unless, of course, you are suggesting that you are considering signing the pact. Hardly. Agano replied. But do continue. I find this talk quite amusing. Sakura chose to ignore the comment. She couldn't let the man rile her up, which was clearly his intent. Finally, I would like to discuss a proposal involving bequeathing citizen rights to Baijiu, as well as protections for them and their hosts against village discrimination. This got another laugh out of Agano. So we're giving rights to monsters next? I doubt they're even sentient enough to appreciate the sentiment. Next you'll be asking we give citizen rights to tornadoes or earthquakes. Then it is clear, Lord Agano, that you are coming from quite the place of ignorance involving Baijiu. So that's it, then. Temari spoke, and this time Sakura could feel the hostility leaking off of her, feel the killing intent. So this is how you justify stealing our Jinhuriki. If you're a vocal advocate for their rights, then it paints you as the good girl, rescuing the poor Jinhuriki from the terrible village. I wasn't stolen. Gaara replied. I willingly joined with this project dash. And in doing so crippled our village and aided in a rebellion that has shrunk our borders considerably. Temari snapped. I don't know why you've even bothered to try to rope Suna into this. It is clear that you have been our enemy since day one, and any Kage in this room should be considering what it is that Harano intends to steal from them next. And personal grudges aside, Takeshi finally spoke up, leaning forward onto the table. What guarantee do we have that you will be able to enforce such a pact? Any village could sign this and simply do as they willed while your back was turned. Or even in plain view of you. A Jinhuriki might be intimidating, sure, but one Jinhuriki cannot control an entire village, let alone 8 of them. And as for you, Harano, as Agano stated before, I am not impressed. And what would it take to impress you then, Lord Takeshi? Sakura challenged. I feel as though no matter who sat in this chair, you would doubt their ability to maintain order. If you feel so little towards my capabilities to maintain this pact, then there is no harm in you signing it. As you say, if it is so easy to act while my back is turned, then signing this would only benefit you. You would have access to exclusive trade routes, information, all these things while not having to worry about actually upholding your end of the bargain. Perhaps so. Takeshi agreed. But my point still stands. Why you, over so many other more capable shinobi? How do we know you are capable of upholding order? You don't. Sakura answered. You don't know. But if you don't give the opportunity to prove myself to you, you'll never know. Then I say we give her an opportunity. Agano's smile sent a shiver down her spine, and Shikamaru's words came to her. Danzo, either he or someone under his influence is going to ask you to do something in the coming weeks. The Churyunin exams start tomorrow. That is the real reason all of us have gathered here. If Harano thinks herself capable of playing peacekeeper between 8 shinobi nations, then getting through the exams should not pose a challenge at all for her and her little team. And that would give us a chance to see if her battle skills live up to the rumors going around. I think we should see the little ambassadors participate. Sakura felt her blood run cold. The exams. She managed to spit out. Surely you're joking. We have organizations like Akatsuki working against us and you want me to waste my time taking the exams. Are you worried you will fail? That's not the point dash. I agree with Lord Agano. Temari spoke up. Let her participate. If she does, then we won't have to worry about any of this anymore, and Gaara will return to where he belongs. It might not be as much of a waste of time as you think, Sakura. Oniki added. As silly as it sounds, none of these fools will recognize your talent unless they see it themselves. The exams should hold no problem for my disciple. Sakura bit her bottom lip. This was stupid, this was a waste of time, and she couldn't possibly see why. Oh. Temari had said it. Temari had just as much admitted it. In the Churyunin exams, it was common for a handful of shinobi to die attempting them. Danzo had placed the idea in Agano's mind. Danzo wanted Sakura to participate. Danzo was expecting her to die participating. Legally, which would mean that Gaara and Sai would have no means of retaliating, and from there. As Konan had told her, it would be Konoha's resurrection. Whatever Danzo had planned, Sakura would be unable to interfere if she was dead. And for whatever reason, Shikamaru had known he would do this, and more importantly, wanted Sakura to play along. Fine. Sakura agreed. Me and my fellow ambassadors will participate in the exams. And once they are done, I hope you will reconsider my proposal. For now, it appears that I have some preparing to do. Sakura stood, Gaara and Sai with her, and gave a final, curt bow before turning to leave. Chapter 50, Coming Storm, Intermission Part 9. Konoha is cold and wet and irritating. And maybe that is why its people are so damn annoying. Growing up in this sort of environment would make anyone miserable, and miserable people were miserable to deal with. The last time Temari had set foot in Konoha, it hadn't been quite so depressing. Colder than wind country, yes, but not this downpour that had been going on ever since she'd arrived. It's a drag for sure. The Nara, Shikamaru, was one of the only people Temari found remotely agreeable in this country, and even he was tiresome in his own way. It never rains this much here. My mom keeps saying it's those people from Rain that dragged it in. Wouldn't doubt it. Temari replied. They say it's always raining in AIM. Probably just rumor. The land would flood if it rained this much all the time. There's always rumor coming from there. They call the Omekajin, Angel of God. Shikamaru frowned. Are all cage that full of themselves? I'm a cage too, in case you forgot. Point stands. Shikamaru's frown turned into a tiny smirk. Temari couldn't help but smirk back in reply. The boy had grown some guts, at least, since the last time she'd seen him, and he was more than willing to participate in some of the harsher banter that she was used to dealing with in Suna. She'd made Danzo promise, when the dust had settled, that he'd leave the Nara boy alive. Shikamaru was an escort, her escort specifically while she stayed in Konoha. Konoha wasn't foolish enough to let foreigners walk around freely, not after the last exam had led to such a devastating invasion. Temari felt a small pang of guilt knowing what was to come. Konoha was prepared enough to deal with foreign invasion when it was united, but it was nowhere near prepared enough for a schism from within. Danzo had been counting on that. In that regard, She was glad Shikamaru had been promoted to Chiyunin. If he wasn't in the exams, no risk of harm. Too attached, Temari told herself. At the end of the day he's just another Konoha soldier. Another potential enemy. Shikamaru left her and her bodyguard's sides once she arrived at the small building that had been reserved for her people. There were several genin teams all staying in their own quarters, a show, for the most part, as it wouldn't particularly matter who did well in the exams and who didn't. But more importantly than the genin team were several of her village elders, who were as of now gathered in a small room, huddled around several scrolls. They had come on the premise of wanting to watch their village thrive in the exams, but really they were here for a more secret purpose. One of them, an older woman by the name of Cho, looked at Temari expectantly as she joined them. "It is nearly done," she announced as she funneled chakra into the scroll. "If Danzo's people can't figure out the rest from here, then they deserve to fail." "Is it really so simple?" Temari questioned, kneeling down to examine the seal work being written by another elder. "I had thought Shukaku's seal was meant to prevent precisely this from happening." "Don't insult me, you young brat. I was the one who crafted the seal to begin with. If there is anyone alive who can make this happen, it is me." "Yes, I suppose that is true." Temari couldn't stop a small pang of worry from sounding in her own voice. What this would do, Temari had never been one to hesitate when it came to war, and considering that they had intended for similar consequences to occur the last time they invaded, she shouldn't have felt worried at all. But this time was different. Gaara was not with them. Once these scrolls were activated, Gaara wouldn't be. But who was she to talk? She and Gaara had never been close. Temari forced herself to think of the Gaara of her childhood, the one who reveled in killing and bloodshed, the one who was as much a monster outside as he was inside. Remembering that always helped steel her resolve towards him. Tomorrow would be a big day, and Temari needed rest. She made her way to her bedroom, where she was grateful to be allowed some time to herself. Not completely alone, of course, not ever. Her bodyguards were just outside and Danzo had assured her his agents would always watch for threats outside. But she was caged now, which meant she'd probably never really be truly alone ever again. Suna refused to let another Orochimaru incident occur. No matter how strong she became, Temari would never stop looking over her shoulder, and neither would the rest of Suna. She refused to dress down in a foreign country. Her clothes were as much armor as they were a statement of proper Suna fashion, and she would be a fool to remove protection. So as she made her way to her bed, she simply laid herself down on top of the covers, not caring if her shoes dirted the pristine Konoha sheets. She laid her fan against the bed before leaning back and closing her eyes. She got all of 5 minutes of rest before energy appeared, energy that was dark and familiar and terrifying all in one. Danzo's agents apparently weren't completely good enough to stop a Jinhira from coming through her bedroom window. Temari wasn't surprised. Gaara was, still was, the strongest shinobi she knew. Temari. Gaara. She opened her eyes and sat up, not wanting to appear weak in front of her brother who was now the enemy. Temari pushed down her emotions and put on a face of discontent. "I don't think your pretty little friend will fare well if everyone hears her pet is breaking into the Kazekige's room. I want to talk, Temari." "Fantastic." Temari rolled her eyes. "You're a few months late to a talk, but I'm sure we can fix Suna's problems with a friendly chat between siblings." "You're angry." "Obviously. You left us, took our village's strongest weapon with you, and then went and spearheaded a coup at our northern borders. All because little Miss Harano batted her eyes and pretended to be your friend. Now Suna is weakened, and it's only a matter of time before plains or grass start pushing at our defenses and seeing how much they can take." "Plains had formed before Sakura and I arrived there," Gaara retorted. "Father was dead. Our numbers thinned. Me leaving changed none of that. That doesn't change the fact that you don't want to be Kazekage." Temari blinked in shock as Gaara spoke over her. "You never wanted to be Kazekage," Gaara continued. "You saw what it did to father. Did to our family. You wanted to raise a family without worrying about them being used for Suna's purpose. Kankuro too. None of us. I remember what you said back then. Even then, I listened." "What does it matter?" Temari replied. We needed a cage. Someone had to step up. Offer the title to Satomi. What, the Plains girl? Temari hissed. She's a rebel. She leads the rebels. If she's cause a cage, the rebels rejoin Suna. There would be no more Plains. Don't think you can manipulate me. You want Satomi in charge because then Suna would go along with your little pact. No. Don't lie to me. You're my sister. And then Gaara looked at her, only it was a different look than Temari had ever seen on the boy's face before. He was pleading with her, she could see the begging in his eyes, the desperation. So much emotion all at once, so much that Temari thought she might be hallucinating. Gaara had never shown this much dedication or resolve, this much passion for something. Temari wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was Suna that had been holding him back. You're my sister. Gaara repeated. Maybe we've never held any love for each other, but I would rather not turn against my family. I've already done that once. Temari remembered their uncle, Yoshimaru, found crushed and bloodied on a rooftop. Father had claimed Yoshimaru had been sent to test Gaara's mastery over Shukaku. She didn't know what that test had been, only that she had lost an uncle. Gaara had went cold ever since that day, cold and brutal and savage. But now, when she looked at Gaara, she saw only regret. This brought anger to the forefront of her mind. Now Gaara chose to have regrets, now when it was so damned inconvenient for everyone. She didn't have an uncle because of him. She didn't have a mother because of him. Please, Temari. Suna won't suffer if you listen to Sakura. If everyone is being held to an agreement, Suna won't need Shukaku, and dash. Get out. Temari whispered. Gaara, just get out. She couldn't deal with it. The emotional whiplash. Seeing Gaara so secure in himself now, feeling herself so insecure. He could break any moment, Cho had told her. Shukaku loves worming his way into people's minds and tearing them apart from the inside. How long before he turns on the Harano girl and brings everything to dust around him? Temari. He was a monster, Temari reminded herself. A monster who had learned how to smile. A monster who was learning empathy. He killed their mother and uncle. And now she was going to kill her brother. It's too late. She insisted with a shake of her head. I'm sorry, Gaara, but it's too late. It wasn't too late for me. Their eyes met and lingered for a moment, silence falling over the room. Then, in a small flurry of sand, Gaara was gone. Temari didn't know how much time passed before she found the will to push herself to her feet. She burst through the door of her room, running down the stairs and pulling open the door to the elders' quarters with a huff. Lady Temari. One of the elders looked to her in confusion. What's the matter? The scrolls dash. We just passed them over to Lord Danzo. Cho confirmed. I told you not to worry, child. Everything is in place now. Temari felt the air around her grow cold. Wordlessly, she returned to her room. It was too late. It was too late. Rule number 25 of the Shinobi Code, a shinobi must never show their tears. Thankfully, in this heavy downpour of rain, there was nobody around to notice. It was only after being away from Konoha for so long that Kakashi realized just how ingrained this habit of his was, visiting the memorial stone upon which Rin and Obito's names were engraved. During his time in IWA, he often found himself wandering in search of it, only to turn up lost somewhere deep within the village. It garnered a bit of negative attention at first, but Kakashi managed to turn it around and give everyone the impression that he simply liked to wander. Though he noticed rather quickly that there was nowhere in IWA that he went without hidden escort. During those wanderings, Kakashi came across countless other memorial stones, and it sunk in then just how many shinobi had died during the last war, many of which had been killed at the hands of himself and his sensei. It had been admittedly sobering, and since he did not have his home's memorial to spend time with, Kakashi ended up spending time with Iwa's memorials instead. He read the names, over and over again until he could recite many of them in his sleep. Names of shinobi who had been like Rin and Obito. Shinobi who were like Sakura. Kakashi hadn't been invested in Sakura's neutrality pact before then. But standing in front of the IWA memorial stones then, that had been the push. And now he was home and routine came back to him as easily as breathing. His companions weren't buried here, of course, it was merely a memorial. Rin had been given over to her family, and Obito. They never found the body. Sakura had come to him time and time again with her thoughts and theories about the Kyuubi attack 14 years prior. She was stuck on one particular thought involved Uchiha Madara. They never found the body, did they? Eyes could be transferred, Kakashi was the proof. Was someone walking around with Madara's Sharingan? Or perhaps, even less likely of course, was Madara alive after all this time, walking around, scheming? They never found Obito's body. But Obito's body had been crushed, there was no possible way anyone could have retrieved Obito from there, let alone an intact Sharingan. It was far more likely that someone was walking around with Madara's eyes, as far-fetched of a concept as that sounded. But the thought tugged and nagged at Kakashi's mind, even if it was just the sinking realization that, for all his posturing and all his mourning, he never went back to retrieve Obito's body. Another thing he'd missed. Another failure. Sakura was participating in the Chunin exams now. It was impossible to miss that news. The cage meeting had gone poorly, that much was clear, but she had been given an opportunity to prove herself. She'd trained under the Tsuchikage, fought off Itachi Uchiha, so why was Kakashi so damn worried? Something was wrong. Things weren't adding up. There was something going on behind the scenes, something he'd missed. Something they'd all been missing. Or maybe he was just a paranoid wreck. But it was the paranoia that had kept him alive all these years. Paranoia and a secret. Kakashi lifted up his headband, exposing his Sharingan eye to the wind and rain. The Sharingan was always active, maybe it was a result of being implanted, or maybe he'd just never figured out how to turn it off. It was a constant strain on his chakra, but as a result his chakra reserves had grown to match, until now it was barely a trickle on his energy. He squinted through the rain until he spotted an errant branch on a tree nearby, with one or two leaves haphazardly grown into its wood. Then, Kakashi focused. It was different than using the Sharingan to copy. It required flexing his eye in a way he wasn't sure anyone else could flex. He felt something in his eye move, and then, all at once, it happened. The space around the branch warped and pulled, sucking in the branch and leaves until it cut off the tree with a snap and disappeared. Kakashi stopped flexing and took a deep breath. That pulled on his chakra reserves, as much as an A-rank jutsu would, and it sometimes hurt to do. Today, there was no pain, only exhaustion. The portal had been too small to cause pain. He wasn't sure how he'd learned this ability. He'd never seen Sasuke use it, though not for lack of watching and prodding, and his one lead, Itachi, had never used such an ability either. But Kakashi remembered facing Itachi that day, seeing the Tomo in his eyes spin and lock together into an entirely different shape. A different Sharingan. A more powerful one. Madara, Sakura had told him, had been capable of controlling the Kyuubi with his eyes. A feat no other Uchiha had replicated. But Itachi had unlocked an ability that had never been registered in Konoha's database of Sharingan knowledge, that strange Tsukuyomi that had distorted time and subjected him to the worst torture he'd ever experienced. And now he had unlocked an ability, not similar to the Tsukuyomi, but equally unique. An ability that he'd used to get him out of tight spaces in battle, but an ability he didn't dare reveal to anyone else, not yet, not until he knew what it was and why. Sharingan could evolve. But Kakashi didn't know how he'd done it, and now the only two Uchiha left alive who could tell him were missing Nin. With a sigh, Kakashi pulled down his headband. It was a dead end, seemingly, but he couldn't stop himself from thinking about it. Not when it might be a clue. The wind shifted, and Kakashi shivered, which was strange. The cold usually didn't bother him, but something in the trees. As he turned to look, a flash of green greeted him, and Kakashi was face to face with Guy. Kakashi. My eternal rival. The man announced, his boisterous voice breaking Kakashi's thought bubble completely. I admire your persistence in honoring your fallen comrades in such a downpour, but your vigil will have to end here. I'm not really in the mood to spar right now, Guy. Well, that is good. Guy replied, his trademark grin glistening even in the rain. because we Jounin have been called for a meeting with Hokage, and I have no doubt she would protest to us coming in with fists flying. Ah. Kakashi let out a small sigh of relief. Just a meeting. Before the Chunin exams, it was to be expected. Thanks for getting me, then. But that does not mean we cannot have a friendly race on the way to the Hokage's quarters. Right. An even deeper sigh made its way from his lungs. A race. Of course. Kakashi put on an air of annoyance, but in actuality, he was grateful. Guy, above everyone else in the village, was truly the best at the one thing Kakashi could never figure out how to do for himself. Distraction. The rain fell on the memorial stone for several minutes after Kakashi left. The water ran down the firm rock, pooling below until the dirt beneath it was so soaked that it was beginning to form a small puddle. Quietly, a dark figure landed, his presence not even disturbed the water at his feet. Obito put his hand to the memorial stone, running his fingers along it until he came to a stop at his own name. Obito Uchiha. He had not heard his name in years, not since he had taken up the mantle of Madara. He ran his fingers over each engraved letter, repeating the name in his mind until it ceased to be anything but syllables on stone. It had been so long since anyone had said his name, that he wondered if it was even his own anymore. Seeing Kakashi here had been a vindication. See what you have wrought, Obito thought to himself, his hand moving upwards to rest on Rin's name. Remember what you did. Remember who you killed. You swore to protect her and now she's just a name on a rock that only you ever visit. It wouldn't matter soon. Already the preparations for making a brand new world of peace had begun. Madara's plan was in motion. It would be only a month longer before the containment was ready, funded by revenue from a megacour and efficient bounty hunting handled by the other members of Akatsuki. Nagato had been pushed and prodded until he was set on course to bring the plan to fruition, and when everything was in place, Obito would become God, and God would put the world into eternal, blissful sleep. There was just one bump in the road. The girl, Sakura Haruno, who had broken into the Uchiha compound and challenged Itachi, threatened to weave the world together without promise of godhood or eternity. It wouldn't work, of course, not with men like Danzo pulling strings from the background, but that someone else was willing to try and break the wheel that the world spun upon was both admirable and threatening. And she'd been Kakashi's student, no less. A small part of him wanted to see just how far Sakura was capable of taking her little plan. A part of him wanted to see her break, wanted to see her fall apart as he had and realize that there was only one way, only one answer, and that was to bend the world to one's will with strength and technique. And she had power. Obito could practically taste it. Something about the way her chakra ran across her skin, as if it wasn't even hers but something alive that had just chosen to reside in her body. He'd never seen chakra like that before, never felt chakra like that, something that had forced its way into his mind that night when he had seen her visage in his reflection. A bloodline technique, it had to be, and whatever it was had given her the power to resist the pull of a Mangekyo Sharingan. It was as if her chakra was alive. And she hadn't even seen fit to use it against him that night, not even as his kunai dug into her skin, not even as he dragged her partner to the other side of the Kamui. Not that she'd needed to. Had she known, then, what throwing the fourth Hokage's kunai was invoking him. There was no way she could have possibly known, it was coincidence-made weapon, but she had not hesitated in striking while the iron was hot. Sakura did not hesitate. She saw a chance and took it. She'd need to, if she wanted to change the world. How funny, Obito thought, that Kakashi's own student would be far more similar to him. She was Plan B, Obito decided then and there. Plan B when all else failed. Madara had come to him when age overcame him, knowing that he could pass on his plan to another who was just as worthy. If the worst came to pass, Sakura. Sakura would make this new world. And she would make it right. She would make it his way. All he had to do was make her see. Make her understand. And already Danzo was doing it for him. Tomorrow the Chunin exams would begin. Tomorrow the Ichibai Jinhiriki would die and Shikaka would be in his hands. Tomorrow Root would overtake Konoha and deal with the traitor that had left for Sakura's side. Sakura would lose everything. And then, truly then, she'd be just like him. The rain followed her, always. It was a sign from Nagato. A blessing, some might call it. Proof that he was always there watching over her. He'd promised it to Yahiko, after all, that he would keep her safe, and Nagato had kept his promise to him in full. Konan was a capable kunoichi. One did not become a Mekage by being weak, but she knew that if her own strength ever failed, Nagato would be there. The shinobi of AIM viewed him as a deity. Konan could never see Nagato that way, not having grown up alongside him, seeing him as a child, but she could see why others would come to view him as such. The Rinnegan had only ever been seen before in the Sage of Six Paths, who was revered as a deity by many shinobi. Nagato was the next coming of the sage. That he should be revered as such was only proper. Even now, the 3 genin that Konan had brought with her to Konoha prayed to Nagato's image. Well, no, it wasn't truly Nagato. If anything, it was Yahiko they prayed to, his flesh made into a vessel of Nagato's wool. They'd brought a makeshift shrine with them to Konoha, and in the center of it was a depiction of Yahiko. The genin bowed and asked for God's protection in the coming days. They asked for strength to succeed in the exams. They asked for courage to do what needed to be done. Konan sometimes wished she had a god to pray to. When your best friend was God, where did that leave you? An angel, AIM told her. A messenger of God. A divine protector. Sometimes Haiden called her a blasphemer, and she had to fight to keep herself from laughing. She was more inclined to agree with him than with the shinobi of AIM. Her shinobi prayed, and instead of praying Konan wrote the same message over and over on different strips of paper. Each one she folded perfectly into the shape of a bird, and as she ran her chakra over the paper, the wings flapped and the paper bird came to life. Her chakra would protect it for 2 days, which was more than enough time for it to soar through the air, high into the clouds, and then come back down to Konan's intended recipient. Sakura Harino had learned far too much of Akatsuki in her time abroad, and their people needed to be wary. Nagato, of course, was yet unknown, and so were Deidara and Sasori, but everything else Sakura had reported with extreme accuracy. They'd slipped up. They needed to prepare. It was unfortunate because Nagato's likely conclusion would be to kill her before she put too much together. Unfortunate, because Konan found herself liking the girl. Much like Yahiko had been in his youth, so too moved Sakura, desperately trying to pull warring villages together and prevent bloodshed. Moving against Danzo too, no less, and Konan could not fault her that. If Sakura could give Danzo a taste of his own medicine, that would be vindication enough. But the girl was young and playing with fire. Danzo moved in the shadows, twisting and turning events to his will. Sakura was too young to know how to play at a proper shinobi. She had the power, and she had a sharp mind, but it wasn't enough. Amaha. Samidare. Urin. The 3 genin looked towards her, wordless and obedient. They were young, perhaps too young for battle, but that hadn't stopped her, so how could she stop them? The Hokage Tsunade wanted to ban child soldiers. In another universe, where Sakura was successful, would these children still be learning and growing under the safety of AIM rooftops? The children noticed the grimace on her face and each bowed low, not wanting to displease her. Konan reached out to gently touch Urin's head. She was the leader of the group, though it went unsaid. You will have a secondary objective tomorrow, she announced. This objective is surpassed only by your continued survival. At all other costs, you will keep the girl known as Sakura Harino safe from harm. Yes, my lady. The 3 sounded in unison. They did not look surprised to hear this objective. Rather, they looked pleased. I heard she wishes to end war. Amaha said aloud. Of course God would favor her. If God favors her, then she will not need our help. The boy, Samidare, retorted. God favors her, which is why he sends us. Urin ended the debate with a single sentence. The 3 nodded as one, then returned to their prayer. Konan could not help but feel a sentiment inside her that was almost motherly in nature. These young ones were already so dedicated to Nagato's cause, so ready to follow him into making a new world of peace. But Konan worried over this vision, worried over what the consequences might be. The Byakuya were violent creatures. She wanted to trust Nagato's ability to contain them, trust in what they had built, but even if they did contain the Byakuya, they would be using them. Making Jinhyuriki out of the Akatsuki, maintaining world peace with an iron fist. There would be no need for war if Nagato's 9 crushed the war out of everyone. Power, Nagato had said, that was the only thing that shinobi responded to. Peace could not be born with words and promises. Peace was born through power. He hadn't always thought that way. Konan wondered every day if such thoughts were right. So, she could afford to place her bets on Sakura. Sakura was the other path. If she too faltered in her way, if she too was torn apart by powerful men who only thought inwardly, then Konan would know for sure. Chance happens once, but twice? A trend. She would be unable to deny Nagato's words if Sakura fell too. Let her live, Konan prayed, not to any god in particular but to the world, if it was listening. Let her live and prove him wrong. Let her live and prove me wrong. Biological manipulation was an art, and damn anyone that tried to insist otherwise. Once upon a time, Orochimaru had managed to create a cell line from a single piece of bone from Hashirama Senju's corpse. The cell line had been powerful, exuding a unique chakra that had always brought a smile to Orochimaru's face whenever he'd felt it. It had killed 49 of the shinobi he'd injected it into, but had been taken up successfully by the 50th, which was as good of a success rate as anyone could have hoped for. True to form, the shinobi had been granted the power of Hashirama's wood release, albeit a bastardized version of it. The boy couldn't raise forests with a wave of his hand, couldn't level mountains with its power, but he could seal away a Baijuyo's power and grow, at the very least, 1 or 2 decently sized trees with it. It was a pity that the cell line had been destroyed. It might have made these experiments so much easier. A single strand of hair from Kagaya at Satsuki was a stretch to believe in, but Orochimaru knew the truth of the Zetsu creature's origin, and if anyone was capable of retaining any part of Kagaya, it was them. It was almost as if they had been waiting for someone to come along and take it, to try and recreate what was once the most powerful being on the planet. But a single strand was barely enough to work with. With Hashirama's bone, Orochimaru had plenty of room for error. With this, he had one shot. One chance to make a viable cell line. One chance to recreate the power of a goddess. But if he did, oh if he did, his final vessel could be crafted, and he would have a power to surpass that of both Uchiha and Senju. It required chakra, copious amounts of chakra, and a mixture that would serve as the nutrients for the cell line. Cells couldn't grow on nothing, but even then Orochimaru worried that it wouldn't be enough. What nourished a goddess, anyway? Had Kagaya ever eaten at all, or simply absorbed chakra from the air to power her body? The energy had to come from somewhere. He would have little time to figure out exactly what the cells required, once they had been crafted. Recreating a stem cell from a developed cell was, in theory, biologically impossible. Orochimaru spat on such a term. He was biologically impossible in his own immortality. Jutsu made the impossible a reality. Jutsu would make Kagaya live again, even if it was only in tiny pieces. Behind him, Kabuto stood at the ready. This jutsu had an incredibly high chance of just killing him outright, especially if Kagaya's power proved too difficult to contain. It required him to maintain perfect focus, perfect chakra control, and it required the seals he'd so carefully crafted to do their job and not explode in his face. But if this body died, he'd just take another one. Death didn't scare him anymore. Orochimaru took a deep breath and flew through several dozen hand signs. Around him, the seals began to activate. Inside the petri dish in front of him, the strand of hair began to squirm and writhe as chakra pulsed through it. Orochimaru felt a push back then, which all but guaranteed that this had to have been Kagaya's. It pushed and pushed, desperate to break free of his influence, but Orochimaru had fought this sort of battle before and knew just when to pull, just when to push back, and bit by bit he broke the strand down into its most basic elements. That the hair was so intact after all this time was but a testament to Kagaya's power. She was said to have been immortal, if not for the fact that her sons had put her down. The DNA within the strands had not degraded over time, which was a miracle, and exactly what he needed to thread chakra through to create his new cell line. All the components were there, all the nutrients, everything. Before his eyes, the strand seemed to fizzle to ash. Orochimaru cursed. The pushback had suddenly stopped. A failure. It couldn't be a failure, not after all this time. How could he have destroyed it? He flew forward, thrusting the petri dish beneath a microscope. His eyes searched along the plate, desperately looking back and forth until... There it was. There it was. 4 beautiful, round, perfect cells. The energy that came off of them was faint, but as Orochimaru focused he could feel it there within the media. The Kagaya line, he said aloud, pleasure dripping from his voice. A success. Excellent, Lord Orochimaru. Kabuto replied, always eager to please. Percent confluency. 1%, if that. But it will be enough. We shall treat these ones with utmost delicacy. If it truly is Kagaya's line, they will not die so easily. The first difficult step had been completed. Now he would let the cell line grow, until he had enough to start crafting subjects for injection. If the Hashirama line had a 2% success rate, what would the rate of the line of a goddess be? It might be thousands before Orochimaru had success, but he had time. All the time in the world. Assuming, of course, that the Akatsuki didn't end it prematurely, messing around with the Baijuyu as such. He would have to deal with that sooner rather than later. He would be ready for Sasuke soon. With the Uchiha blood, he stood half a chance. He didn't need to beat the Akatsuki, just ensure they didn't get in his way. They maintained somewhat friendly relations for now, but he couldn't trust Pain to not butt his nose in where it didn't belong. And speaking of which, don't you have a meeting soon, with Sasori? Orochimaru questioned Kabuto. Ah, yes, of course. Kabuto replied. And you are certain he has yet to realize I have freed you of his influence? Quite certain. Sasori is very confident in his jutsu, and in his superiority over you. He doesn't think for a moment that you could have bested him. Good. As it should be. You will report to me immediately once you are through. Of course, Lord Orochimaru. Orochimaru turned his attention back to the cells, watching them eagerly. Pieces were coming into place. The world was turning, and he with it. Soon, he would be the most powerful shinobi to walk to planet. Soon. Soon. Sasuke Uchiha, if you stick your elbow in my rib one more time I will rip off whatever I can get my hands on first. HN. It wasn't what Sasuke had expected to spend his afternoon doing. Huddling in an air vent, surrounded by Karen's seals, gazing down at a small room with no light and copious amounts of dust, it was, quite frankly, beneath him. But Karen had insisted that it was important, their one-way ticket to finding Itaka once Orochimaru was dealt with. Important enough to cram themselves together for, each of them desperately searching for breathing room before whatever was to happen happened and they had to hold perfectly still. Thankfully, Sasuke didn't have much longer to wait. Kabuto walked into the room. Sasuke recognized the man by his chakra alone. He was wearing a thick hood, and clothes that hid his figure. Behind him walked something else. It might have been a man, but it was hunched over so much that it also could have been a sentient orb. Sasuke saw a face peek out from the huddled body, and saw the aura of a living being's chakra around it, but whoever this was had fucked up his body even worse than Orochimaru had. And here, as usual, Lord Sasori. You have checked the seals. Thrice over, my lord. Good. There is much I would hear from you. The huddled man's robes were dark, and in the dim light Sasuke didn't see it at first, but as the man moved to the center of the room he noticed red clouds on the robes and realized instantly why Karen had been so insistent that he come. This man was Akatsuki. He worked with Itaka. Sasuke couldn't suppress a small shiver of excitement. This was a clue. This was a step. Orochimaru still believes that he has freed me from your influence, of course. Kabuto began with a chuckle. His ego surpasses all other shinobi. But he has successfully isolated a cell line from that hair Zetsu gave him. He calls it the Kagaya line. This does not worry me. The man, Sasori, admitted. He will be dead before he sees this plan to fruition. What I need to know is of a different nature. Sasori handed a small, folded piece of paper to Kabuto. Kabuto looked over it for a while, and Sasuke wished he could glimpse even a word or two of what was on there. Thankfully, he wasn't left guessing. There's been an information breach, has there? Kabuto said with a smirk. Little Sakura Haranos managed to name 5 of your 9. How very interesting. Our leader demands that she be dealt with. It is possible that she will die in Konoha under Danzo's hands. But if she does not, she will be heading here, to Otagakure. Does she honestly think she can sway Orochimaru? She is a naive child. So, naturally, yes. Now that will be amusing to listen to. You will be prepared for her arrival. You will ensure she is detained. Then, Deidara and myself will eliminate her and retrieve the Ichibai for our organization. There was a strange clacking sound as the man turned towards the door. A sound almost like wood rubbing together. Is this understood? Yes, Lord Sasori. Everything will be ready for you, should this come to pass. Sasori left. Kabuto lingered for a couple of minutes, reading over the paper in silence. Then, he too left. Sasuke let out the breath he had been holding. How long? Sasuke asked. How long has he been a double agent? Oh, it gets deeper than that. Karen replied with a chuckle. He's got his own story so warped I can't tell who he's working for. He tells Orochimaru that Sasori doesn't know where his loyalties lie. He tells Sasori that Orochimaru doesn't know where his loyalties lie. He's very good. And he's been this good for as long as I've known him. It doesn't matter which one of them comes out on top, he'll always have been loyal to them this entire time. So where do we come in? I just thought of it, actually. Oh, it's the perfect way to take Orochimaru down a peg too. Orochimaru uses Kabuto like a crutch. He needs a skilled medicnin to make sure his body doesn't collapse under all that weird experimentation. But what if he learns that Kabuto really isn't his double agent? He wouldn't let Kabuto live. Sasuke concluded. And then Orochimaru is without the help. All we have to do is wait for that Harano girl to get her ass over here, and Orochimaru is as good as dead. Her name is Sakura. Sasuke insisted, trying his best to ignore the pit that grew in his stomach at the mention of her name. Akatsuki wants her dead. What have you done since I left, Sakura? What have you become? And Sasuke can't help but shiver again with a strange sort of anticipation. Once upon a time, Sasuke thought that only Naruto was capable of matching his strength. Now, hearing this, now he wonders. Now he hopes. Right, Sakura. Karen continued to talk. We'll get this ball rolling once she's here. For now, we'll keep an eye on Kabuto. Make sure we can see whatever he might be setting up. Sound good? HN Sasuke grunted in response before squirming his way backwards. Right now, he was just desperate to get out of this damned vent. Haydn dreamed of home. It wasn't unusual, this sort of dream. He missed home, missed the hot water springs that filled the air with pleasant steam, missed the sounds of sparring echoing through the hollowed caves that ran beneath the country's feet. He even missed the calmness of the meditation chambers, and in the dream his mind walked through the peaceful halls until he came to be in the chamber. He sat before the altar of Jashin, crisscrossed, arms held in prayer position at his chest. He took a deep breath, and he could smell the musk of the caves, feel the chakra running through its stones. At the altar were 2 candles, one white, one black. The black one was lit. It had been lit since his initiation years ago. His candle, Haydn thought, a sloppy grin coming to his face. The indication of his power. So long as that candle was lit, he was alive and Jashin's power ran through him. He heard a sound not unlike the striking of a match. Then, before his eyes, the white candle lit. Haydn awoke with a curse. Many curses. An entire long stream of them that woke Kakuzu up in the bed across the room, and ended with Kakuzu throwing a kunai directly into his jaw. He couldn't curse if his jaw didn't work, that was likely the rationale there, but out of spite Haydn just kept grunting and moaning. It had happened. But why now of all times? And to whom? They'd expect him to return. But he couldn't. He was here by order of Jashin, and who was he to disobey? If orders conflicted, he'd go with the ones that came straight from the source. Besides, it wasn't as if he wanted to meet whatever miserable bastard had gotten designated as his other half. Some snivelly little bitch, most likely, someone Haydn would want to stab, even if that was the highest form of blasphemy. Another kunao made its way to his throat. He couldn't make noise if his windpipe was busted. Haydn let Kakuzu have his silence for now. He was sure the man would already be grumpy, having been woken from slumber so early in the morning. No point tempting fate further. One day I'm going to rip all 5 of that man's hearts out. Half an hour later, after Haydn had worked the kunao out of his jaw and throat, a paper bird fluttered into the room. Kakuzu caught it with a stray thread from his arm, pulling it close and reading it, still lying down. Eventually he sat up, looking strangely bemused. Remember that girl from Wind Country? Little Pinky Badass. Haydn answered, his voice slurred as his jaw healed itself back together. Yeah, what about her? She had the Ichibai with her. She had the what? The Ichibai. Right under your nose. Right under your nose too, you stupid motherfucker. Haydn yelled, running over to pull the paper from Kakuzu's hands. And, what the fuck is this about killing her on sight? She has the Ichibai. Kakuzu shrugged. She'll likely protect it. She's got a death wish already. Fucking shit, Kakuzu, I just converted her. Maybe. Fuck it all. Not everything is about your stupid religion. God, I really hope you eat shit and die one day, Kakuzu. Haydn crumpled the paper in his hand, then dropped it on the floor and stepped on it. Pinky had better not come anywhere near him. As much as he enjoyed killing, there was no way he could bring himself to kill a potential recruit. She'd had promise. He cracked his jaw back into place. Looked like today was shaping up to be one hell of a shit show already. Check the description for the links to the author.